Hello everyone, I'm the Creeps Cabin. I know you use these videos to fall asleep. So before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. I remember it was late October when this happened. I was 14 and excited for Halloween that year. A buddy of mine lived out in a rural area, about 15 minutes out of town, and he invited a bunch of us over for a Halloween bonfire. His family had a big backyard that stretched pretty far, ending in a thick line of dark woods. Behind the trees was just more woods and fields, nothing else. His place was the last house on a small gravel road, and his nearest neighbor was a mile down the road. I didn't really think much of that back then. We were just happy to have a place to hang out away from parents, streetlights, and any adults who might come tell us to quiet down. I remember it was cold that night, colder than usual for October. When I stepped out of my dad's truck with my sleeping bag rolled under my arm, I felt the wind bite at my face and neck. The sky was clear though, stars everywhere, and the moon was bright enough to light up the tops of the trees behind his house. My buddy's dad had dragged out a metal barrel and filled it with chopped wood for us to burn. They already had it going by the time I arrived, flames flickering and cracking high into the air with orange sparks flying up every time someone threw in a fresh piece of wood. We all gathered around it, warming our hands and roasting marshmallows and hot dogs on metal skewers. I remember standing there for a long time, just staring at the flames, listening to the music someone was playing off a small Bluetooth speaker. Some kids were trying to scare each other with ghost stories, and I was only half listening because most of them were stories we'd all heard a million times, about kids who went missing in the woods or about ghosts who followed people home from abandoned buildings. I knew they were just stories, but I guess my brain stored those details somewhere anyway. At some point, after drinking a couple cans of Pepsi, I felt like I had to pee. The kid whose house it was pointed off towards the woods and said, "Just go over there, man. There's bushes." I didn't want to walk all the way back to the house to use their bathroom and track dirt inside with my shoes. So I nodded and walked away from the fire towards a line of tall bushes about 20 feet away. I remember the ground was hard and cold beneath my shoes, little rocks pressing into my soles as I stepped away from the warmth and laughter of the group. The further I walked, the darker it felt, until all I could hear behind me was the crackling of the bonfire and a couple kids laughing. When I got to the bushes, I unzipped and started peeing. It felt good to finally empty my bladder after all that soda. I was looking down at the dirt in front of me, seeing little weeds and dry grass leaning sideways from the breeze. The shadows of the bush branches moved back and forth in front of me. Then I noticed something move in the corner of my eye, out further towards the woods, probably about 50 yards away from where I was standing. At first it didn't register because my eyes were adjusted to the close darkness around me. I kept peeing, but then realized that something was moving slowly back and forth out there. My heart started beating a little faster. I thought it might be a deer at first, because they're everywhere out in the country, always moving through people's yards at night. I finished peeing and looked directly over towards where I thought I saw the movement, squinting into the darkness. I didn't see anything, just the black shapes of trees standing still, and the ground sloping down a bit into a ditch before rising back up into thicker woods. I shook myself off, zipped up, and told myself I was being stupid, probably just the wind moving branches. But when I turned to head back towards the bonfire, I caught it again in my peripheral vision. This time it looked darker than the trees, like a solid shadow moving between two tree trunks. My stomach dropped, and I felt goosebumps rise all over my arms. I turned my head quickly to look directly at it, thinking I'd catch a deer looking back at me with glowing eyes, but there was nothing there. Just empty dark woods, completely still. My heart was pounding in my chest now. I remembered something my science teacher told us once, that our eyes are better at picking up light and movement in the dark using our peripheral vision because of the rod cells there. I didn't want to stand there any longer, but I wanted to know what I was seeing. So I turned my head a bit away from the woods, keeping the area just at the edge of my sight. It felt terrifying to do that, like I was letting something sneak up on me, but I did it anyway. That's when I saw it again, clearer this time. There was a tall figure, darker than everything around it, pacing slowly back and forth along the edge of the woods. It moved like a person, one foot in front of the other, and it looked like it was looking over towards the bonfire where my friends were sitting. I couldn't see a face or clothes, just a tall dark shape moving calmly back and forth. My whole body went cold. I felt sweat start to form along my hairline despite the freezing air. I wanted to run back, but my legs felt like they were stuck to the ground. I don't know how long I stood there staring at it out of the corner of my eye, but eventually I managed to move. I turned my whole body away and forced myself to walk back quickly towards the fire. Each step felt heavy, like I was walking through deep water. I kept expecting to hear fast footsteps coming up behind me or to feel a hand grab my shoulder, but I didn't. When I got back to the group, I felt so shaky that I almost fell onto the log I was sitting on before. My friends noticed I looked freaked out, but I didn't care how I sounded. I told them exactly what I saw. My buddy who lived there went pale. He ran into the house and told his dad. I watched his dad come out a minute later. He was wearing a brown jacket and jeans, holding a long gun by his side. It wasn't a hunting rifle, just a long old shotgun he used to scare off coyotes. He didn't say anything to us. He just walked past the fire and headed towards the woods. I watched him walk down into the ditch and come back up onto the other side. He stood there for a long time, shining a flashlight between the trees and across the edge of the woods. I was holding my breath the whole time. My chest felt tight, and I kept my eyes on his flashlight beam, waiting for it to suddenly catch a figure standing there, waiting, watching him. But there was nothing. He turned back and walked towards us again, his boots crunching on the frosty grass. When he got back, he just shook his head and said there was nothing there. He told us to be careful walking near the woods, though, just in case there were coyotes or a stray dog hanging around looking for food. I nodded along with the others, but inside I knew what I saw wasn't a coyote or a dog. It was walking on two legs, pacing calmly back and forth like it was thinking about something, like it was deciding whether to come closer or stay hidden. The rest of the night, I couldn't relax. Every time I turned my back to the woods, I felt eyes on me. I kept staring out towards the trees, trying to see if it would come back, but I never saw it again. Some of the kids teased me a bit, saying I was just trying to scare them, but deep down I knew what I saw. When it got late, and we all rolled out our sleeping bags around the fire to sleep, I lay there staring up at the sky, feeling the cold air bite at my nose and cheeks, listening to the leaves rustle softly in the woods. Every little snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made my heart jump. I kept thinking about how the nearest neighbor was so far away, and how if someone wanted to come watch a group of kids out here, there would be nothing stopping them. No fences, no locked gates, just dark open fields leading up to silent trees. Eventually I fell asleep out of exhaustion, but even then I dreamed of someone standing at the edge of the woods, staring at me. When I woke up in the morning, the sun was already rising, and I could hear birds chirping in the trees. My face was freezing cold, and I could smell leftover smoke from the burned-out fire. Everyone else was still asleep except for my buddy's dad, who was sitting on the porch drinking coffee. I looked back towards the woods one last time before I left later that morning, trying to see if there were any footprints or broken branches. But the grass was covered in morning frost, and everything looked untouched. To this day, I still think about that night sometimes. I tell myself it could have been my eyes playing tricks on me, or maybe just my mind making up shapes in the dark because of all the scary stories. But deep down, I know what I saw. I know how it moved, how it stood tall and dark, pacing back and forth calmly like it had all the time in the world. And what really gets me is the thought of someone being out there in the middle of nowhere, watching a bunch of kids by a fire, with no car or bike or anything to get there, just standing there, hidden by darkness, watching us from the woods. That thought alone still makes my skin crawl every time I remember it. When I think back to that old house, it feels like thinking about some place that wasn't even real, like a weird, quiet memory of a place that only existed for a little while before I ever really understood what life was about. I was about 4 years old. It was just me and my mom living there. She worked at a small office back then, not far from our house, and sometimes my uncle would come visit or her friends would stop by, but mostly it was just the two of us. The house was small, pale yellow paint with paint peeling off the wooden trims around the windows. The porch was old, with chipped boards that sometimes groaned when you stepped too hard on them, and the front door had a brass knob that would stick if you turned it wrong. I remember the smell of that house, a smell like dust, old carpet, laundry soap, and the sweet cheap candles my mom used to light to make it feel more homely. My room was small with one window that looked out to the left side of the yard, where there were a few half-dead bushes. The window frame was always cold, and when I touched it, it felt like the cold would crawl through my fingertips and up my arms. At night, the window would rattle a little if the wind was strong. I used to keep stuffed animals along the window ledge. Sometimes they'd fall off in the middle of the night, and it would wake me up. But the dreams were the worst part of living there. It started one night when my mom had put me to bed early. She had to wake up early the next morning, so she wanted to get her sleep too. I fell asleep without any problem, but woke up in the middle of the night, in the dream. It felt so real I didn't even know it was a dream at first. I remember walking out of my room. The hallway was dark, but there was always this small nightlight plugged in near the floor. It gave off a dull orange glow, just enough to see the floor so you didn't trip. I walked down the hallway to my mom's room. Her door was half open, like it always was when she slept. But as I walked in, I saw that the room was empty. Her blankets were messy and thrown around like someone had gotten out of bed in a hurry. The curtains were drawn shut, but a small crack let in a slice of white streetlight from outside. The room was quiet, the air heavy and still. And then suddenly it was like someone grabbed me by the neck and lifted me up off the ground. I could feel my feet dangling, my arms frozen at my sides. I couldn't see who was holding me. I could only feel the grip cold and tight around my throat, lifting me higher so that my head almost hit the low ceiling. Then the voice came. It was deep, not yelling, but heavy like it came from inside the walls. It said, "You will have this dream 4 more times." I didn't understand what that meant. I remember my throat burned where I was being held, and I was trying to breathe, but nothing would come in or out. I couldn't cry or scream. In the other corner of the room, near my mom's dresser, there was a man. He wasn't doing anything at first, just standing there. He was wearing dark pants and a dirty white shirt with rolled-up sleeves, like a work shirt. His hair was messy, and he didn't even look at me or the thing holding me. He was staring at a tape recorder in his hands. It was an old one, the kind with the tiny cassette tapes that you could pop out and flip around. He was holding it so tight his knuckles looked white in the dark. Then suddenly, without warning, he smashed it against the corner of the dresser. The plastic cracked, and a piece of it broke off. About 1/4 of it was gone. He just dropped the broken part on the floor and stood there holding the rest, staring down at it with this blank, tired look. I woke up right after that. My throat hurt a little, like I had been coughing in my sleep, and my pillow was damp from sweat. I ran to my mom's room and climbed into bed with her, burying my face into her arm so I didn't have to look at the dark corners of her room. She didn't wake up. I remember her breathing, slow and heavy, and I just lay there until morning came through the blinds. I didn't tell her about the dream. I was scared she would say it was just my imagination, or worse, that she would get scared too. A few days passed before it happened again. This time it was the same. I woke up in the dream, walked down the hallway, saw the empty bed. I felt my chest tighten the moment I stepped into her room. The thing grabbed me by the neck and lifted me up again. The same burning feeling where it gripped me, the same silent gasping for breath, my toes curling trying to find the floor. And again the voice came, "You will have this dream 3 more times." In the corner, the man was there. He picked up the tape recorder again. It was missing the piece he broke last time, so you could see the metal parts and the tape spools inside. He slammed it against the dresser again, and another piece broke off. Now half of it was gone. He dropped the broken part and just stood there staring at what was left, his eyes empty. I woke up again, sweating, feeling like I needed to puke. I stayed in my room that time. I pulled the blanket over my head, squeezing my eyes shut, telling myself over and over that it was just a dream, that no one was going to lift me up by my neck, that no one was in Mom's room smashing tape recorders. After the second dream, I started to avoid going down the hallway at night. I would wake up needing to pee, but just lay there in my bed until morning, too scared to move. The hallway felt alive when it was dark. The shadows seemed to reach out a little further, and the nightlight glow made the walls look sick and orange like old skin. Then the third dream came. I don't remember exactly how many days passed between the second and third, maybe 4 or 5. It was the same as the others. I walked down the hall in my dream, into Mom's room, saw the empty bed. My chest felt cold and tight. Then I was grabbed by the neck and lifted up, feet dangling, throat burning. The voice said, "You will have this dream 2 more times." In the corner, the man smashed the tape recorder again. Another piece broke off, so that only a small part of it remained in his hands. I remember seeing wires sticking out, and part of the tape hanging loose like a shiny black worm. He stared down at it, His shoulders slumped like he was so tired he couldn't even stand straight. Then I woke up, heart pounding so hard it felt like it would tear through my ribs. After that third dream, something changed. During the day, I started to feel uneasy in the house. Like if I turned around too fast, I'd see that man standing in the corner, or I'd feel that grip around my neck again. I stopped playing with my toys on the floor. I would sit on the couch and watch cartoons instead, keeping my eyes on the TV so I didn't see shadows moving across the carpet. Sometimes when my mom went outside to hang up laundry or talk to a neighbor, I would feel this panic rising in me, like if she left me alone in the house for even a minute something horrible would happen. I didn't tell her why. I just clung to her arm, following her from room to room like a scared little dog. She would get frustrated sometimes, telling me to go play with my trucks or color books, but I just sat there on the floor near her feet, watching everything, waiting for something to happen. Then one morning she woke me up earlier than normal. She told me we were moving. I didn't really understand why. She just said the landlord had sold the place and we needed to pack up. I remember the boxes stacked in the living room, all our stuff getting wrapped up in newspaper and taped shut. I didn't have the fourth dream. We left before it came. The morning we drove away from that house, I kept looking out the car window at it as we turned down the street. The porch with the broken boards, the yellow paint peeling off, the curtains half closed. I felt this cold feeling in my chest, like if we didn't leave now, we never would. After we moved into the new place, I never had that dream again. I didn't see the man. I didn't feel the grip around my neck. The hallway in the new apartment was short and there was no night light, but I wasn't scared to walk down it at night. The shadows there felt empty, just normal shadows without anything hiding in them. Even though I was only 4, that dream stayed with me all my life. It never came back, but sometimes when I'm half asleep, drifting off, I can still feel my feet leave the floor and that tight burning around my neck, the voice counting down the dreams I'd have left. And sometimes I wonder what would have happened if we hadn't moved, if I'd had the fourth dream. If that man would have finally smashed the last piece of that tape recorder. If the thing holding me up by my neck would have let me go, or squeezed harder until everything went dark. But we moved. Life went on. The dreams stopped. I grew up, but that feeling never left me. It sits in my chest, quiet and cold like the window frame in my old room, reminding me there are some things that we never really escape. We just leave them behind, in old houses, behind peeling paint and broken porch boards, hoping they never find their way back to us again. My dad was driving my brother and me down our back road that afternoon. The storm had come in quick, almost like someone flicked a switch in the sky. It had been bright just 15 minutes before. We were at home, watching the clouds gather, hearing that low rumble start in the distance, feeling the thickness in the air that always came before a real bad storm. I remember how the sky turned that dark gray-green color, the one that always makes my chest feel tight, like something is about to happen that I can't control. Dad had said he wanted to go check the creek down the road to see if it was rising, just in case it would flood over the bridge again like it had last spring. He told us to come with him because Mom was sleeping after her night shift, and he didn't want us making noise in the house. So we got in the truck. My brother sat in the middle, and I sat by the window, looking out at the fields and the old broken fence posts we always passed. The rain started as soon as we turned onto the back road. At first it was just heavy drops, smacking the windshield so hard I flinched at each one. Then it came down like someone pouring buckets straight from the sky, thick sheets of water slamming into the hood and roof. The wipers were going as fast as they could, making that fast rubber sound back and forth, but it barely made a difference. I could see the water building up along the edges of the road, running into the ditches. Hail started falling too, little white pieces bouncing off the hood and skipping along the road like tiny marbles. Each hit made a quick loud pop on the roof above us. It was so loud it drowned out the country music Dad had on the radio, so he just turned it off. I remember thinking how dark it felt, even though it was just past lunchtime. The sky looked like evening, and the clouds were low and fast, swirling in a way that made my stomach twist. I could barely see out my window, but I kept looking because the storm was so strong it felt like something big and dangerous outside. It was the worst rain I had seen in a long time, maybe ever. I watched the trees bend with the wind, the branches shaking and leaves blowing in big clumps across the road ahead. As we went around the bend before the bridge, that's when I saw him. There was a person on the right side of the road, about 100 yards ahead. At first I thought my eyes were messing up, rain running down the window and distorting the view. But as we got closer, I saw it clearer. He was wearing a yellow rain slicker, the bright kind that fishermen wear. It was so bright against the gray storm and the brown road. The slicker hung down past his knees, soaked with rain, the hood up over his head. He was walking really slow, like each step took effort, and his head was tipped down. I couldn't see his face at all. The hood was pulled forward just enough to shadow where his face should have been. It made him look faceless. Just a blank, dark area under that hood. My chest felt cold when I saw him. I don't know why. He wasn't doing anything threatening. He was just walking, but there was something about it that felt wrong. Maybe it was the way he moved so slow, while the wind blew everything else around him sideways. Maybe it was the fact that there was nowhere nearby he could have come from, no houses along that stretch for over a mile. Or maybe it was how he didn't even look up when we approached, didn't brace himself against the wind or hail, just kept walking slow with his head down. We were going about 30 miles an hour. Dad had slowed a bit because the rain was making it hard to see. We were maybe 30 yards away from him when he stopped. He just stopped walking, still facing the direction he was going. The rain was coming down in thick lines, smacking his slicker so hard I could hear it over the noise in the truck. I felt my heart start pounding harder. I didn't know why, but I felt scared. Just watching him stand there, not moving, with his head down and the hood covering his face. We kept approaching. The wipers swung back and forth, clearing the windshield just enough to see him standing there on the edge of the road. Dad didn't say anything, just kept driving, holding the wheel tight with both hands. The road was narrow, no shoulder, just a strip of gravel before the ditch dropped down into a line of overgrown weeds and small trees. My brother leaned forward, squinting through the windshield, probably trying to see his face too. When we were about 5 yards away, just as we were about to pass him, he suddenly sidestepped into the road. He didn't look up, didn't raise a hand or react to the truck. He just stepped sideways, right into our path, so close I saw the rainwater running down the front of his slicker, dripping off in little streams. Dad yelled under his breath and swerved left. Not enough to go into the other lane fully, but just enough to avoid hitting him. My side view mirror was maybe a foot away from his shoulder as we passed. I felt a jolt of cold panic shoot through my chest and into my arms, like I'd touched an electric fence. I twisted in my seat to look back at him as we drove past. He didn't look at us. He didn't do anything. He just stood there in the road for a second, the rain pelting him so hard I could see it bouncing off his hood. Then he stepped back to the side of the road and kept walking slow, with his head down like nothing had happened. I kept staring back through the rear window until the rain swallowed him up and he disappeared behind us. I turned back around in my seat and realized my hands were clenched so tight my knuckles hurt. I could hear my brother breathing fast beside me. The truck was silent except for the loud drumming of hail and the wipers. Dad didn't say anything. He just kept driving, eyes straight ahead, his jaw clenched tight. I kept thinking about him as we crossed the bridge and pulled over near the creek. The water was already rising high against the banks, brown and foamy. Dad got out to look, and my brother and I stayed in the truck, watching the rain hit the windshield so hard it felt like we were underwater. I kept seeing that man in my mind. The way he moved so slow, how he stepped into the road at the last second without even looking up. There were no other cars on that road, no houses he could have come from. The rain was too strong to be out walking in, and there wasn't any destination up ahead except more woods and empty fields for miles. When Dad got back in the truck, he looked shaken. He pulled out onto the road again, and we drove back the same way. I searched both sides of the road, my heart pounding, but he was gone. There was no sign of him anywhere. Just wet grass, flooded ditches, and the endless gray storm. When we got home, I went straight to my room and sat on my bed for a long time, listening to the rain hit my window. My brother came in and sat on the floor, leaning against my bed frame. Neither of us said anything. I think we both felt the same tight feeling in our chests, like our bodies knew something our minds couldn't explain. I kept replaying it over and over. The man, his slow steps, the way he sidestepped into the road without a single flinch, the way he didn't look at us, not even once. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes I saw him. Not his face, because I never saw his face. Just that hood tipped down, his soaked yellow slicker, the rain coming down in hard slanted lines. I thought about why someone would do that. Maybe he was trying to die. Maybe he was mentally unwell. Maybe he didn't even realize he stepped into the road. But the way he did it, so fast and without hesitation, made it feel like he meant to. Like he was testing us, or testing something else. Over the next few days, the storm passed. The creek flooded over the bridge for a while, and then receded. The road dried up, and the hail melted away. But the memory didn't. Even now, when it rains really hard, I think about him. Sometimes when I'm walking alone, and the sky goes dark with storm clouds, I look around half expecting to see a bright yellow rain slicker somewhere in the distance, moving slow with its hood tipped down, hiding a face I never saw. And I always wonder if he ever made it out of that storm, or if he was still walking that road in the rain, alone, faceless, and silent. Last year I lived alone in a condo on the east side of the city. It wasn't a big place, just a small one-bedroom unit on the second floor of a 3-story building. I worked from home, so I spent most of my days in my little office setup by the window. The building itself was fairly quiet. The walls were thick, and most of the people living there were either older couples or single professionals who kept to themselves. It wasn't a place where you heard kids screaming or music blasting late at night. The most noise I ever heard was my neighbor above dropping something on their floor, and even that was rare. My dog was a miniature American Eskimo, pure white with bright little eyes. Her name was Snowy. She was small, probably around 15 pounds, and she was the sweetest dog I had ever met. She never barked at people, not even delivery guys. If anything, she wanted to greet everyone with her tail wagging. She followed me everywhere inside the condo. If I went to the kitchen to make tea, she'd trot behind me and lie down near my feet, watching me boil water and pour it into my mug. If I went to the bathroom, she'd lie outside the door waiting for me to come out. When I worked at my desk, she either napped on the little rug under my chair or sat on her cushion by the window, watching the cars go by. She was like a silent shadow that never left my side, her little paws softly tapping against the laminate floor wherever I went. One night in late February, around 11 p.m., I was sitting on my couch watching a documentary on my laptop. It was cold that night, and the heater was humming lightly in the background. Snowy had been curled up next to me, her head resting on my thigh as she slept. At one point, she woke up and hopped off the couch. I thought she needed to go pee, so I paused my documentary and stood up to get her leash. But instead of going to the door like she usually did when she wanted to go out, she walked to the living room entrance and just stood there, staring at my front door. At first I didn't think much of it. Maybe she heard something in the hallway. But then I saw her for along her shoulders raised slightly, and she let out a low growl. It was so quiet at first I barely heard it, like a deep rumble coming from her chest. I frowned and walked over to her, kneeling down and rubbing her back to calm her. She didn't even turn to look at me. Her eyes were locked on the front door, and as I kept petting her, her growl got louder. It wasn't an angry bark, it was more like a warning growl. Her lips weren't curled back, but the sound in her throat was clear. I stood up and looked through the peephole. The hallway was empty. I opened the door slowly and peered outside. The overhead lights were on, the same dim yellow they always were at night, and the brown carpeted hallway stretched out in both directions. No movement, no sound. I stepped outside for a moment, looking left and right, listening carefully. Nothing. I went back in, shut the door, and locked it. Snowy stopped growling after I closed the door, but she stayed standing there, staring at it for a long time. Even when I went to sit back down, she didn't follow me. Eventually, she lay down by the door and stayed there until I went to bed. I tried to ignore it. Dogs sometimes hear things we can't. Maybe someone walked past earlier and she caught their scent. But over the next few weeks, it kept happening. Not every night, but maybe once or twice a week. It was always at night, usually between 10 and midnight. She would suddenly stop whatever she was doing, stand up, walk to the living room entrance, and growl at the front door. Each time I would check. Each time, there was nothing. No sounds, no shadows under the door, no knocks. Just silence. I told my friends about it. Some laughed and said she probably smelled another dog in the hallway. Others joked about ghosts or spirits, but I didn't believe in that stuff. A couple of friends said maybe someone was creeping around outside my door at night, trying to see if anyone was home. That idea bothered me more than any ghost story. I lived alone. The thought of someone lurking in the hallway in the middle of the night, maybe checking which units were empty, made my skin crawl. I started leaving the porch light on outside my door and made sure to double-check the locks every night before I went to bed. Still, I never saw anyone. One Friday night in April, I had friends over for dinner. I cooked spaghetti and garlic bread, and we drank cheap red wine while sitting around my small dining table, talking about work and relationships and boring adult stuff. Snowy was in heaven that night, walking from person to person, getting head pats and back scratches. After dinner, we moved to the living room to sit on the couch and the floor. Snowy curled up in my friend Jamie's lap and dozed off while we talked. We were in the middle of a conversation about a new TV show when suddenly she woke up, stiffened, and jumped off Jamie's lap. Everyone fell silent as we watched her walk to the entrance of the living room, her little head pointed straight at the front door. Then that growl came out again, a deep, low rumble that vibrated in her chest. Everyone stopped talking. I could see the hairs on her back stand up. My friend David asked if someone was outside. I shook my head and went to the door to check. I pressed my eye against the peephole. Empty. I opened the door a crack, the chain lock still on, and looked into the hallway. No one. No sounds except the quiet hum of the hallway heater. I shut the door and sat back down. Snowy kept growling for a few more minutes before she stopped, but she didn't come back to the group. She just sat there, staring at the door. That night after everyone left, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about how she had never growled before any of this started. She was the type of dog that even liked the vet, wagging her tail at everyone she saw. Seeing her react like that made me uneasy. But what could I do? I couldn't call the police and say, "My dog is growling at the door at night." They'd just tell me it was an animal outside or some smell that bothered her. After a few more incidents like this, I tried to stop worrying. I thought if someone was really out there, they would have broken in by now. Months passed and nothing ever happened. In early December, I took Snowy with me to my parents' house for the holidays. They lived a few hours away, and I spent most of December there, working remotely. Snowy loved their big yard and the smell of grass and old trees. She ran around outside every day, rolling in the frost-covered lawn, coming back inside with little ice crystals stuck to her fur. She seemed so happy there, so peaceful. She slept next to my bed every night, curled up in her small round dog bed. A few days before Christmas, she fell sick suddenly. It started in the morning when she didn't want to eat her breakfast. By noon, she was throwing up and trembling. We took her to the vet immediately. They said it was some internal issue and tried to treat her, but her body was too small and too weak. That evening, she passed away while I was holding her in my arms. She was only 7 years old. I buried her in my parents' backyard near the old oak tree. It was the same place where I used to play as a kid, and now she rests there under the cold winter soil. I cried for days. Even after I returned to my condo in January, everything felt empty without her. The condo was so silent. No little paws tapping across the floor, no warm body curled up against me on the couch. I couldn't even bring myself to vacuum for a while because her white hairs were still on the rug, and I wasn't ready to see them disappear. After she passed, the growling stopped, of course. But sometimes at night, sitting on my couch alone, I would think about all those times she stood there growling at the front door. I would wonder what she heard or smelled that I couldn't. Maybe it was an animal outside. Maybe someone in the hallway. Maybe someone who knew I lived alone. I'll never know. Nothing ever happened to me. I never heard any break-in stories in the building, and I never saw anything strange on the security camera in the lobby. But there's a part of me that still wonders. I think about her every day, about how she protected me in her own way, even though she was so small, how she stood her ground in front of that door, warning me about something only she knew. The condo feels safer now because nothing ever happened, but at the same time, it feels emptier. I still sleep with the porch light on outside my door. I still check the locks every night before bed. And sometimes, just before I turn off the lights, I find myself looking at that front door, remembering how she stood there growling into the darkness beyond, and wondering what it was she knew that I never will. When I was about 13, I was at home one evening. It was one of those quiet weekends when Mom and Dad had invited some old friends over. They weren't just any friends. They were our neighbors from the block of flats where we used to live until I was 5. I didn't really remember them. I had small memories of that flat, like a faded old photo with the corners curling up, but nothing that ever felt real in my head. Mostly, I just remembered bits of sitting on the brown carpet and watching cartoons with a blanket over my shoulders, while Mom cleaned or Dad left for work. That evening, I was sent to bed early, but I wasn't tired. My room was just down the hall from the living room, and I could hear their voices through the door, muffled but clear enough if I stayed quiet. I remember lying on my back, staring at the ceiling with the orange streetlight glow coming through the curtains, listening to the forks on plates, the quiet laughs, cups clinking, and the hum of conversation mixed with the occasional gust of wind outside. I don't know why I was listening so carefully. Maybe I was just bored. Maybe I liked hearing adults talk about their lives. It always made me feel like I was sneaking into a secret world, like they didn't know I was there. They were talking about normal things at first, about old neighbors, about how much rent used to cost back then, about someone's job, and about the lady's new car. But then I heard the woman neighbor say something that made my stomach turn cold. She said, "Hey Digsy's mom, do you remember when Digsy used to complain that there was someone in his room? Well, there's a family that's just moved into the floor above who have a 3-year-old son. He is complaining of the exact same things Digsy did." I froze. My breath got stuck in my throat. I didn't move. I just lay there, feeling the blanket heavy on my chest. I didn't remember ever saying something like that. Someone in my room. The words sounded so unreal, but hearing her say them so casually, like it was just a small memory, made it worse. My stomach started to ache with a tight, nervous feeling. I don't remember anything else they talked about after that. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, thinking about what she said. I didn't sleep properly that night. Every small sound in the house felt sharper. I could hear the clock ticking in the living room. I could hear the wind making the gutter rattle outside. And once I thought I heard something like footsteps in the hallway, but it was probably just my dad going to the kitchen. I lay there till the sky started getting pale, and I finally drifted off for a few hours. The next day, I felt strange. I remember sitting at the kitchen table eating my cereal. Mom was making tea, humming softly. Dad had already left for work. I kept glancing at her, wondering if I should ask. Finally, I just said it. Did I ever say there was someone in my room? Back in the flats. She turned around with the teaspoon in her hand, tapping it against her mug. Her face went blank for a second. Then she frowned a little and said, "You don't remember?" Hearing that made my skin crawl. I shook my head. I didn't remember anything. I remembered the bed I had, with cartoon sheets, and the way the wardrobe smelled of old wood, but I didn't remember anyone in my room. She put the spoon down and sat opposite me, looking serious in that way she did when she wanted to tell me something important. She told me about how I used to wake up crying, saying there was someone in my room. She said I used to say there were footsteps in the hall at night. Things used to go missing, little things like keys, her lighter, a bracelet she wore every day. She told me about the footsteps the most. How at first she thought it was the people in the flat above us, but sometimes it sounded like they were inside our own hallway, moving from the bathroom to my room and back again. She said Dad used to get up and check, but there was never anyone there. I just sat there listening to her, feeling smaller and smaller with every word. Then she told me about the last thing that happened. She was listening to a record one day, cleaning the kitchen. She said it was a sunny afternoon. She could hear birds outside the window, and the record was playing something soft, something calm. Then it started to slow down. Not like it was scratching or skipping, just slowly winding down, like someone was gently pressing a finger on it to stop it spinning. She said she snapped at that point. She had been so tired from it all, so angry, so fed up. She shouted at it. She told it to leave us alone, shouted it out loud. "Will you leave us the fuck alone?" And then, just like that, the record started playing normally again. She said nothing strange ever happened after that. I sat there staring at her hands as she spoke. Her fingers looked tired, the knuckles lined, the skin a little dry from washing dishes so much. She finished her tea and got up to rinse the mug. I just sat there, feeling cold inside. I didn't know what to think. For days after that, I thought about it all the time. I would sit in my room at night looking around, thinking about how I used to wake up scared when I was too little to even remember it. I wondered what I saw. What made me so scared that I told Mom and Dad there was someone there. It felt like there was a gap in my memory, like a dark room in my mind with no door to open it again. Years went by. I grew up, went to college, started working. I moved into different flats with friends, then alone for a while. Nothing ever happened like that again. No footsteps in the hall, no records slowing down. I became skeptical about ghosts and spirits. I thought maybe there was some explanation. Maybe the floors creaked, and it sounded like footsteps. Maybe Mum's record player was old and just slowed down by itself. But sometimes I think about how I found out. Not from Mum, not from Dad, but from someone else, 10 years later, who told the story like it was just a funny little thing. A memory of a neighbor kid who was scared of someone in his room, and now another kid in the same building saying the same thing. That's what gets to me. That another kid, years later, said the exact same thing I did. A 3-year-old boy who probably didn't even know who we were, didn't know anything about me, but was scared of the same thing I was. It makes me think about the rooms we live in. How many people lived in them before us? How many lives crossed there? How many small things stayed behind, silent and invisible? Sometimes at night, I lie awake thinking about the old flat, thinking about the footsteps in the hall and that record slowing down, thinking about my mom standing there in the kitchen shouting at something she couldn't see. I wonder what it felt like for her to do that, to stand there in daylight and tell something she didn't understand to leave her family alone. I don't really talk about it with anyone. People would just laugh or tell me ghosts aren't real. I don't know if it was a ghost. I don't even like that word. It sounds like something from a storybook. All I know is that when I was little, I used to wake up scared, crying to my mom that there was someone there. And now, when I hear small creaks in the hall at night, or the heating clicks loudly in the walls, my body still tenses up for a moment before I tell myself it's nothing. Just an old pipe. Just would settle in. But deep down, there's a small part of me that still feels like that child, staring into the dark room, knowing there's someone there but never seeing them. And no matter how much I tell myself it's nothing, I know that part of me will never go away completely. It stays quiet most days, hidden under work and calls and daily life. But at night, when it's dark and silent, I can feel it breathing inside my chest, remembering something I never really forgot. I woke up earlier than usual that morning. The sun wasn't even up yet. I could see a faint gray light coming through the tent walls. The air was cold and damp, and I could hear birds starting to chirp somewhere far off in the trees. My back hurt from sleeping on the thin camping mat. I shifted a bit, trying to get comfortable, but it was pointless. I was wide awake now. I unzipped my sleeping bag halfway, letting in the cold air. It made me shiver, but also helped wake me up properly. I lay there for a while, listening to the slow breathing of my 2 friends sleeping next to me. We had come out here for a weekend camping trip. Just 3 of us. We had hiked in for about 2 hours the previous afternoon, following a small trail that eventually led us to this flat clearing surrounded by thick pine forest. There was no one else around. It was late July, and most people avoided this part of the forest because it was out of the way. That's exactly why we chose it. I finally sat up and looked around the tent. Everything was quiet. My phone was dead because I forgot to bring the power bank, so I couldn't check the time, but it felt like it was maybe 5 a.m. I decided to get up and start the fire again before the others woke up. I crawled over to the tent door, unzipped it slowly to avoid waking them, and stepped outside. The cold morning air hit me hard. I rubbed my arms to warm up. I walked over to the fire pit we had made last night. It was just a circle of rocks with black ashes and small chunks of burnt wood in the middle. The smell of old smoke still lingered in the air. I picked up a long stick and poked around, trying to find some unburned pieces to use as kindling. After a few minutes, I managed to get a small flame going using leftover dry twigs and some folded paper from a chocolate wrapper I found in my pocket. It took a while, and my fingers went numb from the cold, but I kept blowing into the little flame until it caught on the wood pieces. I sat there for a bit, watching the fire slowly grow, feeling its warmth on my face and hands. The forest was starting to brighten up. I could see mist floating between the trees like low white clouds. Everything was so quiet. No wind, no rustling leaves, just the crackle of the small fire in front of me. I got up to stretch my legs and decided to walk down to the stream nearby. It was only about 50 meters away from our camp, down a small slope through the trees. I grabbed the empty metal kettle so I could bring back some water to boil later for coffee. The slope was muddy, and my shoes slipped a bit as I walked down. When I reached the stream, I crouched down and dipped the kettle into the cold, clear water. I watched as it filled up, tiny bubbles forming on the sides. I looked up at the trees across the stream, just observing the forest in silence. There was something calming about it, but at the same time, it felt a bit eerie. Maybe it was the way the mist moved between the trees like it had a life of its own. I stood up and started walking back. Halfway up the slope, I stopped. There were fresh footprints in the mud going up towards our camp. They weren't mine because they were coming from the stream towards the tents. They looked fresh, the edges still sharp, not washed away by dew or anything. They were normal hiking boot prints, but bigger than my size. I felt a shiver run down my back. I looked around quickly, but saw no one. The forest was still quiet. I tried to tell myself that they might have been made yesterday evening by someone passing through before we arrived, but the prints were too clean for that. I climbed back up, holding the kettle tightly. When I reached the top, I stood still for a few moments, scanning the trees around our camp. Nothing. No movement. I went back to the fire, put the kettle on the rocks to warm it up, and sat down. My hands were shaking a bit, but I didn't know why. I kept staring at the slope through the trees, half expecting to see someone come up at any moment. After about 20 minutes, my friends started waking up. They came out of the tent yawning, complaining about the cold. I didn't say anything about the footprints. I didn't want to start the day with paranoia. We sat around the fire, boiling the water and making instant coffee in our metal mugs. We talked about how we should hike further up the trail after breakfast to explore a small ridge that apparently had a great view of the valley below. While they ate cereal bars and packed their bags for the day hike, I kept glancing at the trees around us. I couldn't shake off the feeling that we weren't alone. When we finally left camp, I looked back one last time before walking away. I felt uneasy leaving our tents and supplies behind, but I told myself it was fine. The hike was tiring. The trail was steep and rocky, and the sun was fully out by then, making the air warm and humid. We kept climbing, taking small breaks to drink water and catch our breath. After about an hour, we reached the ridge. The view was worth it. We could see miles and miles of forest, small streams shining like silver threads in the morning light, and distant hills fading into a pale blue haze. We sat there for almost 40 minutes, taking pictures, eating snacks, and just enjoying the breeze. But even while sitting there, I kept feeling that same uneasiness, like something was off. I tried to ignore it, but it stayed at the back of my mind like a small itch. We eventually decided to head back to camp before noon because the sun was getting harsh and we were running low on water. The walk back was mostly silent. Everyone was tired. When we reached camp, I noticed something immediately. The kettle I had left by the fire was gone. At first, I thought maybe one of my friends had picked it up before we left, but it was nowhere around the fire pit or the tent. We searched for it around the camp, looking in bushes and behind trees, thinking an animal might have dragged it away, but we didn't find it. Then I saw more footprints. These were around the backside of the tent. I followed them carefully, trying not to step on them. They led from behind the tent to the fire pit, and then down towards the stream again. I felt my chest tighten as I realized someone had come into our camp while we were gone. They didn't take our bags or food or anything valuable, just the kettle. We sat down and tried to figure out what to do. One friend suggested packing up and leaving immediately, but the other said it was probably just a hunter or a local who needed a kettle and didn't want to wake us up to ask. I didn't say anything. I just sat there, staring into the trees, feeling a deep, cold fear inside me. There were no other camps nearby. We hadn't seen anyone on the trail or at the ridge. Whoever it was must have been watching us from the forest. We decided to stay one more night because we were too tired to hike back out that day. We spent the rest of the afternoon collecting more firewood and keeping our bags close. None of us said it out loud, but we kept looking around nervously. Every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves made us jerk our heads towards the sound. When evening came, we sat around the fire, eating instant noodles and staring into the flames. The darkness around us felt heavier than the previous night. We didn't talk much. After dinner, we cleaned up quickly and went inside the tent. We zipped it shut and lay there silently. I could hear my own heartbeat in the quiet. Sometime in the night, I woke up to a faint noise outside. I held my breath, listening. It sounded like footsteps on dry leaves, moving slowly around the tent. I felt a burning fear rise from my stomach to my chest. The steps were quiet but close, circling us. I didn't move. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling of the tent, my eyes wide open. I could hear my friends breathing heavily in their sleep. The steps stopped for a while, and there was silence. Then I heard a soft metallic clinking noise. I remembered the kettle. I clenched my hands into fists, feeling completely helpless. Whoever it was stood out there for what felt like hours. I couldn't see anything. I couldn't do anything. I was too scared to even sit up. Finally, the footsteps moved away, fading into the distance. I lay there for the rest of the night, not sleeping at all. My mind kept replaying the sounds over and over again. When morning finally came and the light started seeping into the tent, I slowly sat up. My friends were still asleep. I unzipped the tent and stepped out. The forest was quiet again. The mist was back, floating low over the ground. I walked around the tent slowly. On the ground near the fire pit was our kettle, placed carefully upside down on a flat rock. Next to it was a small pile of blackberries. I stared at it for a long time. My chest felt tight and hollow at the same time. I picked up the kettle and the berries and walked back to the tent. I woke my friends and told them we needed to pack up and leave immediately. They didn't ask questions. We packed everything in silence, taking down the tent and stuffing our bags in record time. Within 30 minutes, we were on the trail, walking back towards the parking lot. None of us spoke during the hike out. Every few minutes, I would look back down the trail, half expecting to see someone following us. But the forest stayed quiet. When we finally reached the car and drove away, I kept looking out the window, watching the trees pass by, feeling like I was being watched the entire time. When I got home that evening, I unpacked my bag slowly. I pulled out the kettle and looked at it for a long time. There was nothing unusual about it, but I couldn't stop thinking about whoever had been in our camp. They didn't hurt us. They didn't take our gear. They just wanted us to know they were there. That was enough to keep me awake for nights after that trip. I haven't been camping since. Every time I think about going back out there, I remember those quiet footsteps circling our tent in the dark, and the kettle placed upside down with berries like a silent message. I don't know who it was or what they wanted, but I know they were close enough to touch us if they wanted to. That thought alone still makes my chest tighten every time I remember that cold, quiet morning in the forest. I woke up at around 5 in the morning that day. The sky was still dark, just a dull blue with the first hint of dawn coming over the hills. I didn't really want to wake up that early, but my back hurt from the thin camping mat I was lying on, and the cold had gotten into my sleeping bag. My body felt stiff, and my arms were numb because I had slept with them curled up under my chest for warmth. I pushed myself up and rubbed my hands together until I felt them come back to life with a prickly feeling. I could hear nothing but the sound of the wind passing through the pine trees above my tent and the occasional flap of the tent fabric as it caught a breeze. I sat there for a while, feeling my knees ache, just listening to the morning sounds. Birds were not awake yet. There was no traffic in the distance, no voices. It was just me and the trees and the cold. I didn't want to unzip my sleeping bag because the cold air outside would rush in, but I forced myself to do it slowly. I reached down and pulled my shoes from the foot of the tent, tapping them against the ground to make sure there were no spiders or anything inside. Then I slipped them on and tied the laces tight because the shoes were old and loose. I grabbed my heavy fleece sweater and put it on over the thermal shirt I wore to bed. Once I got out of the tent, the air felt even colder. It felt like the cold was slicing through the fabric of my pants. I could see my breath float up in the dull light. I stretched my arms over my head and twisted my body left and right to get the blood moving. My knees cracked loudly in the silent morning. My camp chair was folded up under the table, so I took it out and placed it next to the fire pit. The ashes were cold and black, and I could see the half-burnt logs from the night before sitting there like bones. I sat in the chair for a while, watching the horizon get lighter and lighter until I could finally see the green needles of the pine trees and the brown dirt of the campsite floor. I decided to start making some hot water for coffee, even though I wasn't hungry. I moved slowly, almost lazily, taking out the propane stove and setting it on the table. My fingers felt stiff and useless as I turned the knob on the propane tank. When the stove finally lit up with a blue flame, I put the kettle on it and watched the small flame flicker under the metal bottom. I sat back in my chair again, just listening to the tiny roar of the flame and feeling the warmth hit my knees. After about 10 minutes, I poured hot water into my tin cup and mixed in the instant coffee powder. The bitter smell felt comforting in that quiet, cold place. I held the cup with both hands to warm them up and sipped it slowly. The wind felt softer now. The sky was getting lighter, and I could see some pale orange streaks in the clouds. I just sat there, feeling like there was no one else in the world, like I was the only person awake. After I finished my coffee, I stood up and felt my knees crack again. I decided to take a short walk to stretch my legs before anyone else woke up. I zipped up my sweater, grabbed my knife from the table, and slid it into my pocket. I didn't expect to use it, but I felt better having it with me, especially when walking alone in the woods. I left the campsite and stepped onto the narrow dirt path that led into the forest. The pine needles under my shoes felt soft and spongy, and I walked slowly, feeling the cold air on my face. I didn't go too far, maybe half a mile down the path. There was a small clearing there that I remembered from yesterday. It was just a flat area with a big boulder in the middle and a few fallen logs around it. I stood there for a while, breathing slowly, watching the wind move through the grass and small bushes. I could see the sky more clearly from there. It was turning bright orange near the horizon, but still dark blue above my head. When I decided to go back, I turned around and felt my stomach drop a little. There was someone standing in the path about 20 feet away. I froze for a second, my mind trying to catch up with what my eyes were seeing. It was a man wearing a dark hoodie with the hood pulled over his head and some old blue jeans. He was just standing there, not moving, facing me. I couldn't see his face clearly because of the shadow of the hood, but I could see that his hands were hanging down at his sides. I felt my chest tighten. My fingers went into my pocket and wrapped around the handle of my knife without thinking. The man didn't move. He just stood there, like he was waiting for something. I felt a rush of anger mixed with my fear because I didn't like feeling cornered. I took a slow step forward, keeping my eyes on him. He didn't move back or forward. He just stood there. After a few seconds that felt like minutes, he suddenly turned and walked off the path into the trees. He didn't run, just walked calmly like he had somewhere to go. I stood there, staring at the spot where he disappeared. My breathing felt loud in my chest. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to follow him, and part of me wanted to run straight back to camp. My feet felt rooted to the ground. Finally, I turned around and started walking quickly back towards camp. I kept looking over my shoulder every few steps. The trees felt thicker and darker than before, even though the sky was getting brighter. I felt like my ears were straining to hear footsteps or branches snapping, but I heard nothing but my own quick breathing and the rustle of my clothes. My heart felt like it was beating in my throat. When I got back to camp, I looked around carefully. Nothing was out of place. My tent was still there. The stove was still on the table. My chair was still facing the fire pit. I sat down in it, feeling the hard plastic dig into my thighs. My hands were shaking a little. I poured myself another cup of coffee just to keep them busy. As I sat there, I kept thinking about the man in the path. Who was he? Where did he come from? There were no other campsites near mine. The nearest one was over a mile away down the dirt road. I sat there for almost an hour, just staring into the cold ashes of the fire pit, sipping my coffee and feeling my hands warm up again. I thought about packing up and leaving right then, but I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe he was just another camper out for a morning walk, just like me. But something in my chest kept telling me that wasn't true. There was something about the way he stood there, completely still, watching me. It didn't feel like an accident. As the sun rose higher and the light spread through the trees, I felt a little better. I decided to clean up the breakfast stuff and go for another walk, but this time in the opposite direction along the dirt road. I wanted to get my mind off what had happened. I grabbed my knife again and put it in my pocket before leaving. The road was empty and silent except for the sound of my shoes crunching on the gravel. I walked for about a mile until I reached the small hill where you could see the valley below. The sun was up now, and the grass was glowing gold. I stood there for a while, breathing deeply, feeling the warmth of the sun on my sweater. The cold was slowly going away, and I felt a little safer with the light all around me. When I turned to walk back to camp, I saw something that made me stop. Down near the bottom of the hill, near the tree line, I saw the same man again. He was standing half behind a tree, with his head poking out just enough to look up at me. Even from that distance, I could feel my chest tighten again. He wasn't moving, just watching me. I felt a wave of anger and fear rush through me, mixing into something that made my stomach twist. I turned and walked back to camp faster, my eyes scanning the sides of the road. I didn't want to run because I didn't want to look scared, but my legs wanted to run. I kept my hands in my pockets, gripping the knife handle until my knuckles hurt. When I got back to camp, I packed up everything as fast as I could. I didn't care about folding things neatly, or rolling up the sleeping bag tight. I just shoved it all into the back of my truck. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped my stove twice before I finally got it in its box. I kept looking around at the trees, expecting to see him standing there again. My chest felt like there was a rock sitting on it. When I finally slammed the tailgate shut, I took one last look around. The woods were silent. The sun was up and the shadows were getting shorter, but I felt like there were eyes watching me from every tree. I climbed into my truck and started the engine. The sound of it roaring to life felt like a relief. I pulled out of the campsite fast, the tires crunching on the gravel. As I drove down the dirt road, I kept checking my mirrors. Every time I passed a gap between the trees, I felt my stomach tighten, thinking I would see him standing there again. But I never saw him. When I finally reached the paved highway, I felt like I could breathe again. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my fingers hurt. I drove for almost an hour before I felt calm enough to pull over at a gas station. I sat there in the driver's seat for a long time, just staring at the cars passing on the road. I could hear the hum of the trucks and the distant bark of a dog somewhere behind the gas station. I felt like I had left a different world behind me, one where I was being hunted by something I couldn't see clearly. For the rest of that day, my mind kept replaying the moment I saw him on the path, the way he stood there so still, and then later, the way he was hiding behind the tree at the bottom of the hill, watching me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his dark hood and his shadowed face. I didn't go camping alone for a long time after that. I didn't want to be out there where no one could hear me if I screamed. Even now, when I think about it, I feel that cold fear in my chest again, like there is someone standing behind me, just waiting for me to turn around. I never saw him again. I never went back to that campground. I never found out who he was or why he was watching me. But that morning taught me that out there, in the woods, where no one can hear you, the scariest thing is not ghosts or creatures. It's other people. The ones who stand silently in the shadows, just watching, waiting for you to be alone. That is something I will never forget. I was working afternoon shift at the HSBC building in downtown Vancouver. The day had been quiet so far, just the normal flow of people going in and out, security checks, and watching the CCTV monitors to make sure everything was clear. The air inside the control room always felt dry and stale, mixed with that faint chemical smell of cleaning products used in the lobby earlier in the morning. The hum of the cameras and radios blended into the background, becoming part of the rhythm of my shift. Around 3 p.m., I got a call from reception that there was a medical emergency on one of the upper floors. The receptionist sounded tense, her words fast and clipped. She said a lawyer up there, Tom was his name, was having chest pains and might be having a heart attack. I immediately felt my pulse jump. My hands felt cold as I grabbed the AED from under the desk. I clipped my radio mic to my shirt and told dispatch to call paramedics right away. As I walked quickly through the lobby to the elevators, I could feel the weight of the AED bag bouncing slightly against my leg. Each step echoed off the marble floors. Inside the elevator, the walls of stainless steel reflected my uniform back at me from every angle. I watched the floor numbers flick up, one by one, feeling each slight jolt in my knees as the elevator rose. I kept thinking about what I had been taught in first aid training, reviewing the steps in my head. I wasn't going to let him die, I told myself. I'd seen people collapse before, but never someone having an actual heart attack right in front of me. When I reached his office floor, I walked out and immediately saw a small group of well-dressed people standing in the hallway near an open glass door. Their faces were tight with worry, hands clutching cell phones, suit jackets unbuttoned, hair slightly ruffled as if they'd been running their fingers through it out of stress. I pushed past them and walked into the room. Tom was lying on the floor, his white dress shirt crumpled against the carpet, his tie pushed aside. He was clutching his chest, beads of sweat glistening on his forehead under the harsh fluorescent lights. His breathing was fast and shallow, each breath whistling out of his mouth. His skin was pale gray, almost like clay, and his lips looked slightly blue. I knelt beside him, placed the AED bag on the floor, and told the others to move back with a sharp motion of my hand. The carpet smelled faintly of cleaning shampoo, mixed with the sour scent of sweat coming off Tom's body. He kept opening and closing his eyes, blinking slowly, as if trying to keep himself awake. His mouth was trembling, and his fingers pressed so tightly against his chest that his knuckles were white. I could see his suit pants were slightly damp around his thighs where he was sweating. He started mumbling in a low voice, something about his chest feeling like it was tearing apart. I could see his veins bulging slightly on his neck. I kept telling him to keep breathing, trying to keep my own voice calm, even though my heart was hammering inside my chest so loud it felt like it was echoing in my ears. I heard the elevator doors open at the end of the hall. Heavy footsteps came quickly down the carpeted hallway, muffled but urgent. 2 paramedics in navy blue uniforms came in, carrying their bright orange trauma bag and their own defibrillator kit. One of them nodded at me quickly, his eyes scanning Tom as he knelt down and began checking his pulse and vitals. The other paramedic asked Tom a few quick questions in a strong, calm voice while he attached monitoring pads to his chest. I stepped back, feeling the sweat rolling down my back under my uniform shirt. I took out my notepad and pen, recording the time they arrived, writing down the names from their uniform badges, the time Tom collapsed according to his coworkers. My pen was shaking slightly in my hand as I wrote. I kept looking back at Tom, who was now gripping the paramedic's wrist with surprising strength, begging him to save him. His voice cracked with fear as he kept saying he didn't want to die, that he hadn't sorted out his will, that he needed to call his ex-wife, that he needed to say something to her. His words were panicked, like he was fighting to hold on to reality. I could hear the steady beeping of the heart monitor, its sound thin and sharp in the quiet office room. One paramedic told him to relax, to slow his breathing, but Tom was too far gone into his panic. Suddenly, as they were getting ready to move him onto the stretcher, he froze. His eyes, which had been darting between the paramedics and me, suddenly widened. They locked onto something above the paramedic's shoulders, up towards the ceiling. His mouth dropped open slightly. His face, which had already been so pale, seemed to lose even more color. His chin started to quiver, and he tried to scoot backwards, sliding his but on the carpet away from whatever he was seeing. His breathing turned into short gasps, and his eyes were huge and terrified. He kept staring at that spot on the ceiling, ignoring the paramedics completely. Then suddenly he screamed. A scream that was so loud and raw that it made the hair on my arms stand up. I don't fucking believe it. No. His voice broke into a sob halfway through, and then his whole body went limp. There was a heavy sigh noise, almost like his whole chest deflated. The heart monitor gave a long, flat tone. One paramedic immediately began CPR, while the others started getting the defibrillator ready. I stepped further back, pressed against the glass window, feeling my own breath coming in short bursts as I watched them work. They shocked him once, twice, 3 times, but his heart wouldn't start again. After several long minutes, the paramedic doing chest compressions stopped, his shoulders slumping. He looked at his partner, who just shook his head slightly. They disconnected the pads and covered Tom's face with a small blue blanket from their trauma kit. I stood there, staring at his body, feeling my own pulse in my throat, thick and heavy. I looked up at the ceiling where he had been staring, but it was just white tiles with fluorescent lights and the faint circle of a smoke detector. Nothing else. Later, after the coroner came to take the body away, the building felt quiet in a different way. Almost like the air was thicker, like the lights were dimmer, even though they were just as bright as always. I went back to the control room, sat down heavily in the chair, and felt my knees trembling under the desk. My radio crackled with the voices of other guards checking in, and I could hear the muted sounds of traffic outside the window. Everything felt normal and unreal at the same time. I couldn't stop thinking about what he saw. What could make a dying man scream like that, with so much horror in his voice, right before his heart stopped? That night, when I finished my shift, I walked through the lobby, past the glass windows looking out onto the street. People were walking past outside, carrying bags of takeout, talking on phones, looking at their reflections in the dark glass. The city lights blurred slightly from the light drizzle falling against the windows. I stepped out into the cool night air and took a deep breath, feeling the dampness settle into my shirt. The streets smelled of rain, car exhaust, and the faint scent of coffee drifting from a late-night cafe across the road. Everything looked normal, but inside, it felt like something had shifted slightly, like the world had tilted a fraction, showing me a glimpse of something I wasn't meant to see. And just last week, something else happened that made that feeling even stronger. I was working the night shift in another high-rise in downtown Vancouver. It's a new building, modern design with floor-to-ceiling windows and sleek stone floors in the lobby. But it was built on the site of an older office tower that had been torn down a few years back. Now it houses high-end condos with residents who drive imported cars and come home late from work, tired and carrying small plastic bags of groceries. That night, a woman came to the security desk around 11 p.m. Her hair was pulled back in a tight bun, her eyes red and puffy like she'd been crying or hadn't slept in days. She was wearing sweatpants and an old UBC hoodie, looking nothing like the polished residents I usually saw coming through. She told me she had just moved in on Friday, and that every night since then, someone had been trying to get into her suite. She said the first time was Friday night, just a few hours after she finished moving her boxes into the bedroom. She was unpacking her clothes when she heard banging on the door, loud and sudden, rattling the door in its frame. She thought it was just someone knocking hard, maybe a friend or neighbor, but when she called out, it stopped. Later that night, closer to midnight, the doorknob started rattling softly, like someone was gently testing it over and over. She yelled again, and it stopped. She called security, but by the time the night guard got upstairs, no one was there. The hallway was empty and silent. Saturday night it happened again. The same rattling of the doorknob, soft at first and then harder, the metal clicking against the latch with small jerks. She said she sat on her bed frozen, holding her phone in her hand, staring at the door until it finally stopped. So last night, I went up with her to check it out myself. We took the elevator up, the soft hum of its motor vibrating under my feet. When the doors opened, the hallway was dimly lit, quiet except for the faint buzz of the ceiling lights. Her suite was halfway down the hall, near the end. She unlocked the door, and we went in. The place was still cluttered with moving boxes. Some were half open, clothes and towels spilling out, stacks of books in neat towers on the hardwood floor. The kitchen counters had cleaning sprays, empty coffee cups, and unopened mail scattered on top. It smelled faintly of cardboard and lemon disinfectant. I checked the doorframe, the lock, the hinges. Everything was solid, no signs of forced entry or tampering. I walked down the small hallway to check the bedroom window. Even though we were dozens of floors up, everything was secure. She stood in the living room with her arms crossed tightly over her chest, watching me with tired eyes. As I was leaving her suite, pulling the door closed behind, I still think about that day sometimes, even though so many years have passed. The memory comes back at random times, like when I'm sitting in traffic, or when I'm having my coffee early in the morning before the rest of the world wakes up. My name is Jim. Back then, life felt simpler in some ways. I had a small house in a quiet neighborhood, one of those streets where you could leave your front door unlocked and nothing would happen. I had bought that place with my wife a year before my father passed away. Losing him wasn't easy, but life goes on. I remember at his funeral, the priest saying that every man lives on in the memories of his children. I didn't really think about what that meant until much later. My dad was a good man, hardworking, quiet, and steady. He taught me how to fix things around the house, how to change oil in the car, how to keep calm when everyone else was panicking. He wasn't a hugger or the type to say, "I love you much," but I never doubted he did. After he died, Mom gave me this framed photo of him, a simple black frame with a picture of him from the summer before he got sick. He was wearing a faded blue polo shirt and smiling slightly, standing in front of his old pickup truck. That photo meant a lot to me. When I brought it home, I set it on top of the TV in the living room, in a spot where it could be seen anytime you passed by. Over the years, I'd sometimes glance at it and think about what he would say if he were still around. He never met my son, Timmy. That was something that always made me a little sad. Timmy was born about a year after Dad died. He was a curious kid, one of those children who could sit quietly and watch everything happening around him, taking it all in. He would play with his little cars on the carpet in front of the TV while I watched the news or dozed off on the couch after work. I noticed him looking up at my dad's picture sometimes, just staring, but he never asked who it was. I figured he was too young to really care, or maybe he just saw it as part of the room, like the lamp or the bookshelf. When he was about 3, he started talking more, asking questions about everything, but not once did he ask about that photo. I always thought I'd tell him when he was a little older, when he could understand that his grandpa was gone before he was born. That summer was hot, the kind of sticky heat where you can't sleep properly at night, and even when you wake up early, the air is heavy and warm. We had an in-ground pool in the backyard, a simple rectangular pool with a concrete patio around it, and a few faded plastic chairs we'd picked up from a yard sale the year before. My wife and I had always said we'd redo the backyard one day, make it look nice, but money was tight with a toddler, and fixing the place up never became a priority. Still, the pool was a blessing in that heat. I worked long shifts back then, managing a small warehouse across town. Sometimes I'd come home and sit on the edge of the pool with my feet in the water, just trying to cool down and let the tension of the day leave my body before I went inside to start dinner or help Timmy with his toys. I was strict with Timmy about the pool. From the first day he could walk, I told him never to go in there unless I was with him. We didn't have a pool fence back then, though we should have. I used to think he's a smart kid. He listens well, it'll be okay. In the mornings, when I was home, I'd let him play out back while I did things around the house. He liked sitting on the patio with his toy trucks, driving them along the cracks in the concrete. He'd fill his little yellow dump truck with tiny pebbles from the garden bed and dump them back out, over and over again, humming to himself while the sun rose higher in the sky. That morning, I was upstairs folding laundry in our bedroom. The windows were open, and the hot breeze moved the curtains slightly. I remember thinking that I needed to fix the sliding window lock because it was getting stuck again. I could hear Timmy outside, talking to himself in his quiet toddler voice, the way little kids narrate their games. Every now and then he'd make engine sounds or go vroom vroom, and then mumble something else. It felt peaceful, just a normal summer morning. I was sorting through a basket of socks when I heard it. The sound was sharp and sudden, echoing up through the open windows. A splash. The splash of something heavy hitting the water. For a second, my brain didn't process it. Then my heart stopped. I dropped the socks all over the floor and ran. I don't think my feet even touched the steps as I flew down the stairs, my chest tightening with every passing second. My mind was racing with 100 images of what I would find. Timmy's small body floating face down, his little blue t-shirt soaked and his hair plastered to his forehead, the water rippling around him. The sheer terror of those thoughts was enough to make my legs weak, but I forced myself to keep moving. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I heard something else. Silence. No splashing. No crying. No gasping for air. My stomach twisted into a knot. I yanked the back door open so hard it slammed against the side of the house. The sunlight was blinding for a second, but then my eyes adjusted and I saw him. Timmy was standing there on the patio, soaked from head to toe. His t-shirt clung to his small frame, his shorts dripping water onto the hot concrete, forming a little puddle around his bare feet. His hair was dripping wet, and his eyes were wide but calm. There was water all around him on the ground where he stood. I could see wet footprints leading from the pool to where he was standing. My legs gave out a little as relief washed over me. I walked over quickly and dropped to my knees in front of him. His skin was cool to the touch, little goosebumps forming on his arms in the warm air. I grabbed a towel off one of the chairs and wrapped it around him, drying him off as best as I could, my hands shaking the entire time. I kept looking at his face, trying to see if he was in shock or if he had swallowed any water. His breathing was steady. His chest rose and fell like normal, and there was no water coming out of his mouth or nose. He seemed fine. I kept wiping him down, trying to calm my own heartbeat. I checked his arms and legs for scrapes, thinking he might have slipped on the edge, but there was nothing. His knees were a little red from kneeling on the rough concrete, but other than that, he was perfectly fine. As I dried his hair with the towel, he looked up at me with his clear brown eyes, blinking a little against the bright sun. He didn't seem scared. He didn't seem shaken at all. In fact, he almost looked peaceful, like what had just happened was nothing out of the ordinary. I sat back on my heels for a moment, staring at him, trying to process it all. My heart was still racing, and sweat was dripping down the back of my neck. I asked him what happened, how he got out of the pool. He just looked up at me, tilting his head slightly like he was trying to find the words. Then he said it so simply, so matter-of-factly. He said that he fell in the water, but then the man on top of the TV saved him. At first, I didn't understand what he meant. The man on top of the TV. Then it hit me. He was talking about the picture of my dad. For a second, I just sat there staring at him, feeling this cold wave of confusion wash over me despite the hot morning sun. I didn't say anything to him about it. I just picked him up and carried him inside. I got him changed into dry clothes, gave him a snack, and sat him down with his cartoons while I sat on the couch nearby, trying to wrap my head around what had just happened. All day, I kept thinking about it, going over every detail in my head. I tried to make sense of it rationally. Maybe he slipped but managed to grab the edge and pull himself out. Maybe he didn't actually fall in all the way. Maybe his imagination just filled in the blanks when I asked him what happened. Little kids say strange things all the time. They mix up dreams and real life. They invent explanations for things they don't understand. That's what I told myself over and over again. But that night, after I put him to bed and the house was quiet, I sat alone in the living room with the TV off and just looked at that photo of my dad, the man on top of the TV, his steady eyes looking back at me from that simple black frame. I thought about all the times as a kid when my dad kept me safe without saying a word. The time I almost slipped off the roof when we were fixing the gutter, and he grabbed the back of my shirt so fast it felt like he had extra arms. The time I almost ran into the road chasing a basketball, and he grabbed my arm just before a car flew by. He wasn't loud about protecting me. He just did it. Quietly. Steadily. Without hesitation. I sat there staring at that photo for a long time. Eventually, I stood up and went into Timmy's room. He was sleeping peacefully, his small chest rising and falling under his blanket, his face relaxed. I watched him for a moment, then closed his door softly behind me. I never told my wife exactly what Timmy said that day. I didn't want to worry her or confuse her. I never told my mom either. It just became something I carried with me, a memory tucked into a quiet corner of my mind, something that still comes back to me sometimes when I least expect it. The next morning, I ordered a pool fence. I installed it myself a few days later, sweating under the hot sun with blisters forming on my hands. As I drilled the last panel into place, I felt a sense of calm wash over me. I knew it wouldn't stop everything bad from happening in life, but it was something, a way to keep him safe, a way to do what my dad always did for me. After that day, Timmy never mentioned the man on top of the TV again. He still looked at the photo sometimes, but he didn't say anything about it. I never asked him either. I didn't want to put words in his mouth or confuse him about what he thought he saw that day. Over the years, the photo stayed there, gathering a little dust at the corners of the frame. Every now and then, when I'd clean the living room, I'd pick it up and wipe it carefully, making sure the glass was clear and the frame wasn't smudged. I'd look at his eyes and think about how life goes on, how people leave and people arrive, and how sometimes, even when they're gone, they're not really gone. That day was scary in a way I can't fully. I woke up that morning to the quietness of summer, the kind of quiet that only comes when you're home alone. I didn't have chores that day, which was rare because usually my mom left a list on the fridge. But that morning, there was nothing. Just her note saying she had left her laptop home for me to use, so I wouldn't be bored. I remember feeling happy about that. Back then, using her laptop felt like freedom. Our old computer in the living room was slow and noisy, but her laptop was fast and had a smooth keyboard. It felt like holding the future in my hands. I spent most of the morning just sitting cross-legged on my bedroom carpet with the laptop on the floor in front of me. The carpet was worn down where my desk chair rolled back and forth over the years, but it was still softer than the wooden floor downstairs. I had my window open. Outside, I could hear bugs buzzing and birds yelling at each other in the trees that lined the street. Every now and then a car drove by, but the neighborhood was pretty dead quiet otherwise. Our house was old. I never thought much about how old until later, but it was built in the late 1800s or early 1900s. The second story was added on years after the original build. Because of that, whenever someone walked downstairs, you could hear it. You didn't just hear it, you felt it. The vibrations came up through the beams and into the floor under your feet. Sometimes, if someone walked too close to the wall downstairs, the windows rattled in their frames. It was just how it was. Anyone who's ever lived in an old house with hardwood floors knows that sound, that vibration, that feeling of weight moving beneath you. I didn't think about any of that as I sat there messaging my friends on AIM. Back then, AIM was my life. I spent hours talking to friends, changing my away messages every 10 minutes with song lyrics, or passive-aggressive statements about homework, or how tired I was. It was early afternoon when I realized I was getting hungry. I left the laptop on the carpet and went down to the kitchen. The kitchen tiles were cold under my bare feet, but the smell of the old wooden cabinets felt comforting. Everything about that kitchen was old. The creaking hinges, the chipped enamel sink, the tiny window above it with paint peeling off the sill. I made myself a bowl of cereal because it was the easiest thing, and I ate it leaning against the counter, staring out into the backyard. After I was done, I washed the bowl, left it on the drying rack, and went back upstairs. All afternoon was the same. I lay on my stomach, sometimes with my legs bent up, sometimes rolling onto my back, typing away to friends who were equally bored. Time felt like it slowed down. The sun moved across the sky outside my window. The light shifted from bright to golden to dull orange as evening came. It was close to dusk when I heard it. First, it was the deep rumble of an engine coming into the driveway. I didn't even have to look to know it was my stepdad. His burgundy Chevy Denali had a specific sound to it, heavy and grumbling, but I still looked anyway. I pulled the navy blue curtain back and saw the front of his truck angled into the driveway. The headlights were off, but the last bit of sun reflected off the hood. I felt my stomach tighten a bit. I wasn't supposed to be using my mom's laptop, even if she gave me permission. He hated when I used her things. I didn't want an argument. I quickly told my friend on AIM that I had to log off, that my stepdad was home, and closed the laptop. I sat up and listened. I heard him set the alarm on his truck with a little beep. I heard his heavy footsteps as he walked up the porch stairs. The porch creaked like it always did under his weight. I heard him fumble with his keys. I heard the front door open, then close, then the sound of him dropping his stuff in the den. All of it was so normal, so completely normal. I thought about how he would probably come upstairs and yell at me, so I decided to go down first. I picked up the laptop, hugged it to my chest, and walked to the stairwell. That's when I noticed it. The lights downstairs were all off. Every single one. The living room, the den, the kitchen, the hallway. All dark. I stood there at the top of the stairs, looking down into that darkness, thinking maybe he just didn't turn them on. He knew the house better than anyone. Maybe he was in the bathroom or putting something away before turning the lights on. I forced myself to chuckle quietly at how scared I felt for no reason. The house felt colder than it did earlier, but I thought maybe that was because the sun was setting. I started down the stairs slowly, my hand tight on the railing. Each step creaked under my weight, echoing into the quiet house. I reached the bottom and stepped off onto the hardwood floor. It was colder than I expected. I stood there in the dark for a moment, staring into the den, trying to see if he was sitting on the couch or something. I whispered out an apology about using the laptop, but there was no sound back. No sigh, no chiding, no sarcastic laugh, just silence. My eyes adjusted more to the darkness. That's when I realized something that made my chest feel like it stopped working. His things weren't there. His work bag wasn't dropped next to the couch. His shoes weren't by the door. The keys weren't on the hook. I felt my heart start to beat so hard it hurt my ribs. I turned slowly to look out the window into the driveway. The porch light was on, buzzing gently with moths hitting the bulb, but his Denali was gone. Completely gone. The driveway was empty. Panic rose up from my stomach into my chest. I ran to the back door and checked the locks. The deadbolt was in place. The knob was locked too. I turned and stared at the dark kitchen, feeling like the shadows were pressing in on me. Every hair on my arms and neck stood up. I ran back upstairs, 2 steps at a time, almost tripping over myself. I slammed my bedroom door shut and locked it. My breathing was rough and loud in my ears as I grabbed the cordless phone off my nightstand and sat on my bed. The room felt too quiet. I pressed the phone tight to my chest and listened. That's when it started. The footsteps. I could hear them downstairs. Slow at first, like someone was just walking casually around. But then there were more. It didn't sound like one person anymore. It sounded like multiple people. The floors creaked and shifted under their weight. I could feel the vibrations coming up through the walls, into the floor, and into my feet. Some of the footsteps were light, almost silent, but some were heavy. Stomping. It felt like they were stomping on purpose. My breathing got ragged and tears started to form in my eyes. I pressed the phone buttons with shaking fingers, dialing my first friend, the one who was always talking on the phone. I waited, listening to the footsteps, listening to them move closer to the stairs. Dial tone. 3 rings. Voicemail. I hung up quickly, feeling the tears slide down my cheeks. I tried my second friend, the one who never talked on the phone. Busy signal. My chest tightened so hard it hurt. I tried the third friend. Busy signal again. I slammed the phone down onto my bed and grabbed at my hair. The footsteps got louder, moving under me, around the living room, into the den, back into the kitchen, back again. My whole body felt cold and hot at the same time. I pressed redial on the phone, trying the first friend again, but the dial tone wasn't right this time. Static crackled through it, loud and sharp. I held the phone away from my ear for a second, staring at it. The static changed. It shifted from a crackle to laughter. It wasn't a cartoon laughter or a movie villain laugh. It was real laughter. A man's laugh, low and harsh, echoing in my ear. I screamed and threw the phone down the hallway as hard as I could. It clattered against the wall and fell silent. I sat there for a second, staring at my bedroom door, listening to my own breathing and the sounds of footsteps downstairs. They were so loud, moving around with purpose, like they were looking for something. I wiped at my tears with my sleeves and tried to think. I needed someone to hear this, to hear what I was hearing. I needed to get my friend off the internet, so I could call her. The only way to do that was to get the laptop downstairs. My whole body was shaking so badly, I thought I might throw up. But I stood up anyway. I unlocked my bedroom door slowly, every click sounding like thunder in the quiet house. I opened it, looked out into the hallway, and saw the cordless phone laying on the floor near the stairs. I took a deep breath, told myself to stop being a coward, and ran. I ran down the stairs, my socks sliding on the wooden steps. I grabbed the laptop off the den floor and turned to run back upstairs. As I ran, I could hear the footsteps in other rooms, not the ones I was in. They sounded like they were running now too. Heavy footsteps in the dining room, lighter ones in the living room, and stomping in the kitchen. It felt like the whole house was alive with people I couldn't see. I burst back into my room, slammed the door, and locked it again. My breathing was ragged and my chest burned. I opened the laptop, logged back onto AIM, and typed as fast as I could to my friend, telling her to get off the internet because I needed to call her. I waited, staring at the footsteps moving around under me, feeling them in my feet and in my bones. Finally, she replied that she was getting off. I grabbed the cordless phone from the hallway, locked myself back in my room, and dialed her number. When she answered, I started sobbing, telling her everything that happened. I asked her if she could hear it. She was quiet, listening, but she couldn't hear anything through the phone. I told her to wait, and I walked slowly to the stairwell, holding the phone out. The wooden floor creaked under my feet. The footsteps downstairs seemed to quiet down for a moment, but then they started again. Slow, heavy, purposeful. My friend was silent on the phone, and all I could hear was the sound of people moving below me. I don't know how long I sat there, crouched near the stairs, listening. Maybe 5 minutes. When I was a kid, I used to visit my uncle's lodge every school holiday. My brother and I loved going there. It was a huge property, bigger than anything we saw in the city, and it backed right onto bushland. There were endless trees, dusty tracks, dry grassy clearings, and this creek that only filled up when there was heavy rain. Most days, it was just empty, with cracked mud and tree roots sticking out like veins. My brother and I used to spend hours exploring, playing pretend games, throwing rocks into the dry creek bed, and racing sticks down when there was a trickle of water. One morning, I woke up earlier than everyone else. The sun had just started coming through the dusty curtains of my room. My dog was lying at my feet. His name was Max, a big black and brown dog with floppy ears. He always followed me everywhere. I remember I slipped out of bed, trying not to wake my brother. I got dressed quickly, pulling on shorts and a t-shirt and my old sneakers that were covered in dried mud and grass seeds. My dad had stayed up late watching TV with my uncle and was still asleep on the couch. Everyone else had gone into town to get groceries, so it felt like I had the whole property to myself. I grabbed a stale piece of bread from the kitchen counter and ran outside with Max. It was quiet outside, apart from the buzzing of flies already awake and the soft creak of the old wooden boards under my feet. The air felt warm, even though it was still early. I remember walking down the narrow dirt path behind the lodge, kicking at little stones with my shoes, while Max walked ahead, sniffing around every tree stump and patch of weeds. I started throwing sticks for him, watching him bound away through the dry grass with his tail wagging like crazy. I kept walking down towards the creek. It was empty, as usual, with thin gum trees bending over it and tall yellow grass brushing against my legs as I walked along the bank. I was breaking sticks off fallen branches and throwing them for Max. I remember he would come running back with his tongue hanging out, his chest heaving from excitement, dropping the stick at my feet for me to throw again. At one point, I threw a stick further than before, and it landed with a crack somewhere in the trees on the other side of the creek bed. Max jumped down into the empty creek, clambered up the other side, and then just took off into the trees. I waited, listening for him crashing around, waiting to hear the jingle of his collar or see his tail wagging through the bushes, but nothing. I called out his name a few times, trying to sound confident, not scared. My voice echoed back a little. Still nothing. The wind rustled the leaves above me, and I felt suddenly very alone. I decided to go after him. I jumped down into the dry creek, my shoes landing with a puff of dirt, and climbed up the other side. The bush here was a little thicker. Thin saplings tangled between older trees, and the ground was covered in fallen leaves that crunched under my feet. I walked forward, calling out softly, hoping not to scare him further away. I kept thinking I heard movement ahead, but every time I got closer, there was nothing there. Just empty trees and the distant buzzing of insects. I must have walked further than I thought because after a while, I looked around and realized I had no idea where I was. Every direction looked the same. Brown tree trunks, fallen branches, patches of thin grass and dry leaves. I started feeling that tight feeling in my chest, the kind you get when you're about to cry. I kept calling his name, but my voice started shaking. I turned around, thinking I'd just go back the way I came and get Dad to help me. But when I turned around, nothing looked familiar. I couldn't see the creek bed anymore, or the clearing near the lodge. It was like the trees had closed in around me. I tried to stay calm, telling myself to just keep walking straight. I started jogging, thinking the faster I got out, the better. But the ground was rough, and there were sticks and roots everywhere. I remember my foot catching on something hard and twisted, probably a tree root. I felt myself falling forward. My arms scraped against something rough, and I felt a sharp pain on the side of my head. Then everything went black. When I woke up, I was lying at the bottom of a small gully. The air felt hot and smelled like dirt and dry leaves. I felt dizzy and couldn't remember falling at first. My head hurt, and I tasted blood in my mouth. Everything felt fuzzy, like I was stuck between being asleep and awake. That's when I felt something wet and rough on my cheek. I blinked a few times, and Max's big face came into focus. He was lying right next to me, licking my face gently. I remember feeling so happy and relieved that I almost started crying right then. I wrapped my arms around his neck and buried my face into his fur. He just stayed there, breathing heavily, his body pressed flat against the ground. Then he started making this low, grumbling bark. It wasn't like his usual bark when he saw a car or another dog. This was different. He was still lying down, his body pressed so low that his belly was touching the dirt, and his head was stretched out towards the trees ahead of us. He barked again, a deep, low grumble that made his chest vibrate against my arm. It made my stomach twist with fear. I turned my head to see what he was looking at. Standing a little way up the slope was a man. He looked old, with tanned, wrinkled skin. He wore this faded, dirty cowboy hat with a big chunk missing on the side. He had a thick gray beard and long sleeves rolled up to his elbows, even though it was the middle of summer. His jeans were faded and torn at the knees, and he wore thick leather gloves that looked cracked from old age and use. I didn't know what to say. I just lay there staring at him, my heart thumping in my chest so hard I thought it might burst. He took a few steps down towards me, moving carefully over the loose dirt and roots. He reached out his gloved hand to me, and I grabbed it without thinking. His grip was strong, rough but careful. He pulled me up onto my feet, brushing dirt off my shoulders. Then he turned and started walking up the slope. I followed him quickly, my legs wobbling from the fall, and Max stayed right at my side. He kept pressing against my legs so hard that I nearly tripped over him a few times. I remember feeling annoyed at him for walking so close, but every time I tried to push him away, he just pressed in harder, like he was trying to protect me from something. We walked through the trees without talking. I could hear the crunch of dry leaves under the man's heavy boots and the clicking of his belt buckle as he moved. His gloves felt strange in my hand, thick and stiff with sweat dampening the inside from the heat. I kept looking up at him, wondering why he wasn't sweating or panting in the heat like I was. His cowboy hat cast a shadow over his face, so I couldn't really see his eyes. Max stayed close, almost glued to my side, his ears flattened and his nose twitching as he sniffed the air constantly. After what felt like only a few minutes, we reached the creek bed again. I could hear Dad calling my name from up near the lodge, his voice echoing through the bush. The smell of smoke from the outdoor fireplace drifted towards me, mixed with the smell of cooked meat and dust. I let go of the man's hand and started running up the slope towards the house, feeling relief flood through my whole body. My head was still hurting, and my knees were scraped and bleeding, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get back to Dad and the safety of the lodge. When I reached the top of the slope, I turned around to yell, "Thanks, mister," but he was gone. I scanned the trees, looking for his faded cowboy hat or the flash of his denim shirt, but there was nothing. Just trees and the sound of cicadas buzzing in the hot afternoon air. I thought maybe he'd just walked back into the bush quickly, but something about it felt weird. I didn't think too much about it then. I just ran inside, told Dad I'd fallen over, and ate dinner while Max lay under the table, still pressed against my legs. A few days later, Mom took me into town with her. We went to the small supermarket, the one that sold everything from groceries to fishing tackle and old tools. The place smelled like dust and fertilizer, and the floor was covered in gray tiles with brown stains that never came out. While Mom talked to the cashier about milk prices, I wandered around the store, dragging my fingers along the shelves. Near the checkout was a corkboard with faded photos pinned to it. Some were of kids holding up giant fish they'd caught in the river. Others were of old people sitting outside with big smiles and cups of tea. Then I saw it. A photo of a man wearing a faded cowboy hat with a big chunk missing from the side. He was standing next to a big black dog that looked a bit like Max, except with shorter ears. The man had the same gloves on, and he was holding a shovel in one hand, standing in front of rows of vegetable plants. I felt a strange shiver run down my back. I stared at the photo for ages, my stomach twisting in a way I couldn't explain. When Mom finished paying, I asked the lady behind the counter who the man in the photo was. She looked at me, then back at the photo, and sighed softly. She told me his name was Mr. Rogerson. He used to own the store a long time ago, before she even started working there. Apparently, he grew all his own vegetables in a garden deep in the woods near where my uncle's lodge was. She told me that one summer, he'd gone out there with his dog like he always did to check on his plants. A bad storm came out of nowhere, and his dog slipped down a steep embankment into a small gully. Mr. Rogerson climbed down to get him out, but while he was down there, a branch broke off a tree and fell on him, breaking his back. They searched for him for weeks. When they found him, he was lying there in the gully, already dead. His dog was next to him, also dead from starvation. I remember just standing there, staring at the photo, feeling my stomach twist and tighten. The lady kept talking about how sad it was, how everyone in town still missed him, but I didn't really hear her. All I could think about was that man in the woods with the gloves, holding my hand, leading me back home with Max pressed. It was December of 2004. The air outside was crisp and cold, carrying that familiar winter smell, a mix of wet concrete, distant wood smoke, and the faint scent of pine needles from all the decorated houses on the street. Every evening, walking back from the bus stop after work, I would see the lights twinkling in windows, fake Santas standing on lawns, reindeer lit up in glowing wire frames. Everything felt normal, peaceful even. But inside our house, things had changed so quickly that I almost felt dizzy thinking about it. It had started in November. My brother, who was only 15 at the time, had gone to this Christian weekend camp. When he came back, he wouldn't stop talking about Jesus, about sin, about how our lives were wrong. My dad, always curious about anything that made my brother excited, went with him to a prayer meeting to see what it was about. When he came back, he was different, calmer somehow, but with a weird kind of intensity behind his eyes. My mom fell in line a few days later. Suddenly the house was full of Bible verses pinned to the walls with Scotch tape, crosses hung above every doorway, and stacks of devotionals and prayer books on the coffee table. They started having prayer meetings every evening, the living room crammed with folding chairs borrowed from church, people sitting in circles humming hymns under their breath, mumbling prayers. It was strange to watch them sway with their eyes closed, their faces tilted upwards as if they were seeing something I couldn't see. At first I ignored it. I stayed in my basement bedroom, which I had decorated with movie posters, my art sketchbooks stacked against one wall, ceramic animal figurines lined neatly along the shelf by my desk. I liked it down there. It was cool in the summer, warm in the winter, and it felt like my own little world away from everything. The stairs creaked when people walked on them, and I could always hear footsteps when my parents went to bed or when my brother came downstairs for snacks at midnight. But a week after they turned into what I quietly called Jesus warriors, I started hearing footsteps when no one was supposed to be awake. It was always late at night, sometimes just past midnight, sometimes closer to 3 in the morning. I would be lying in bed, scrolling on my old Nokia phone, listening to the small sounds of the house settling, when I'd hear a creak, then another. Slow, heavy steps moving down the hallway above me, then coming down the stairs. I would hold my breath, thinking someone was coming to check on me, but no one ever appeared at my doorway. The steps would move down the stairs, then stop. Sometimes they would go back up, as if whoever it was changed their mind. The first few nights, I told myself it was the house shifting in the cold, the wood beams groaning and settling. But it didn't sound like that. It sounded like footsteps. Clear, slow, deliberate footsteps. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't want to add to the drama upstairs. The prayer meetings had gotten louder, more intense. People would start shouting prayers instead of just saying them. I would come upstairs to grab food and find them sweating, hands lifted high, eyes shut so tight it made wrinkles on their foreheads. My dad started throwing out anything that didn't fit their new beliefs. First it was the CDs my brother had left in the living room. Then my mom took down every painting in the house that wasn't of Jesus or a Bible verse. One day, I came upstairs and found my grandma's old ceramic flower vases smashed in the garbage can outside. Grandma had just moved in with us after Grandpa died that summer. She didn't say much about it, just sat in her recliner and stared at the blank walls, her eyes wet and distant. Then, the weird electrical stuff began. One night, I was watching a movie in my room on our old VCR TV combo. Halfway through, the numbers on the VCR flashed 666, just for a second. Then they flickered to 999, then back to the normal time. I frowned, thinking maybe the power had flickered, but my lamp didn't even dim. The next morning, I saw the same thing happen to the stove clock while making coffee. The numbers flickered, changing from the time to 666 and back. It was fast like a blink, but I saw it. Things escalated quickly after that. The TV started acting strange. My brother and I were watching cartoons before dinner one evening. He flipped the channel to Nickelodeon, and it skipped straight to channel 66, then to 6, then the screen turned black, and it just said no signal. My brother started crying. My parents came running in, saw the TV, and their eyes widened. My dad told us to get up, and he started praying right there, standing in front of the TV, his voice shaking a little. My mom grabbed her Bible and placed it on top of the TV. The air felt heavy, as if someone had sucked out all the oxygen in the room. I felt lightheaded, my chest tight. When Dad finished praying, he switched off the TV. For a moment, everything was quiet. Then the TV flicked itself back on. Static hissed through the speakers. My dad switched it off again, and this time unplugged it from the wall. That night, they stayed up praying until almost dawn. I lay awake in my bed, staring at the glow-in-the-dark stars I'd stuck to the ceiling as a kid, listening to their muffled voices drifting down the stairs. Every few minutes, I heard the TV turn on again, even though it wasn't plugged in. My parents would stomp over and yell prayers at it, their voices trembling with fear. A few days later, it moved to my brother's stereo. He was in the living room doing homework, and my parents were leading a prayer group in the kitchen. Suddenly, the stereo turned on full blast, shaking the windows with heavy metal music. My brother screamed and ran to unplug it. Even after it was unplugged, the speakers buzzed with static for a few seconds before finally going silent. That was the night my parents decided we all needed to go out for dinner to get away from the house for a while. We went to White Spot, a family restaurant we loved. I remember sitting there picking at my burger, staring out the window at the dark parking lot, feeling a weird tightness in my stomach, like something bad was waiting for us back home. When we finally drove back, I felt my chest sink. The kitchen light was on. We hadn't left it on. We walked in, and my mom screamed. All the candies from the dish on the counter had been laid out in a cross shape on the stove. Neat, perfectly lined up. Just a simple cross. Not upside down, nothing dramatic, but something about the neatness of it made my skin crawl. Mom cleaned it up quickly, her hands shaking, and told everyone we needed to go to bed early. That night, they didn't hold a prayer meeting. They just read their Bibles in silence. I went downstairs to my room, closed the door, and sat on my bed for a long time staring at the floor. My chest felt tight, my hands cold. I kept thinking about those candies lined up on the stove, how careful whoever did it must have been. The next day I went to work as usual. My shift was long, boring, nothing special. But when I got home, everything changed. I opened my bedroom door, and it felt like someone punched me in the gut. My entire room had been torn apart. My posters were gone. My sketchbooks, the ones I had filled with years of drawings, were gone. My ceramic animals were gone. The bookshelf was empty except for my school textbooks. My clothes had been thrown into a pile in the corner. I felt tears sting my eyes as I walked around the room, my hands shaking. I ran upstairs and demanded to know what happened. My mom didn't even look at me. My dad said the church group had come over and cleansed the house of my evil items. I couldn't believe it. Those sketchbooks were my life, my art from when I was 12 until now. My ceramic animals were gifts from friends, birthday presents, little memories I'd kept. And they burned them, threw them out and burned them. I felt something break inside me that day. I called my friend, barely holding back tears, and asked if I could stay at her place. She said yes without hesitation. That night I lay on her pull-out couch, staring at the ceiling fan spinning slowly above me, feeling numb. My parents had destroyed everything that made me feel like myself. I didn't sleep at all. I just lay there listening to the ticking of her kitchen clock in the next room, feeling each second pass like a drip of water echoing in a cave. The next day I went to work, exhausted, my eyes swollen. After my shift, I decided to go back home to talk to my parents. They were still my parents. I was angry, but I thought maybe I could make them understand. I called them before I drove over, letting them know I was coming. My stomach was in knots the whole drive. When I arrived, the house looked normal from the outside. Christmas lights glowing along the gutter, a wreath on the door, snow piled up neatly on the walkway. I walked in, and they were waiting for me in the living room. I sat down on the couch, clutching my hands together, trying to keep calm. Before I could say anything, people started walking out of the bedrooms. The church group, at least 10 people. They surrounded me, chanting psalms under their breath, sprinkling something wet on me that smelled like oil. I stood up, startled, but my mom grabbed me and hugged me tight, whispering "Thank you, Jesus" over and over into my ear. I felt her tears soaking through my shirt. I tried to pull away, but she held on so tight it hurt. Then it happened. The candy dish flew off the counter in the kitchen. It hit the far wall with a loud crack, pieces shattering across the floor. The TV turned on, the volume blasting so loud my ears rang. A framed picture of my parents fell off the wall and hit my brother on the head. He screamed and clutched his forehead, blood running down his temple. My mom let go of me, finally, and I stumbled back, my chest tight, my heart hammering so fast I felt lightheaded. I turned to run for the stairs, but paused when I heard a noise down the hall to my left. The pictures on the wall began falling, one by one in a line, as if someone was walking down the hall and knocking them off as I woke up that morning feeling like I hadn't slept at all. My back was stiff from the thin sleeping mat under my sleeping bag, and my nose was cold from the desert night air that seeped into the tent. I could hear my uncle moving outside already, unzipping his tent and coughing as he stepped into the cold. I rolled onto my side, feeling the dull ache in my shoulder blades from sleeping on rocky ground, and listened to him walk over to where we kept the little propane stove. I didn't want to get up yet. We had driven out here late the night before, past midnight, after my uncle got off work. He and his friends liked to come out to this spot in the open desert and ride their dirt bikes all day. There were 3 trailers parked in a rough horseshoe shape with a little open space in the middle where we sat around a fire the night before. The fire pit was just a ring of rocks filled with black ash, still smoking faintly in the morning air. I could hear him fiddling with something metal, probably the coffee pot. I pulled my hat down over my eyes and tried to sleep again, but the sun was already warming the tent, and I felt sweat forming on my neck under the sleeping bag. I sighed, unzipped the bag, and sat up slowly, feeling every joint in my spine crack. I pulled on my boots, unzipped the tent flap, and crawled out into the morning light. It was quiet, just the sound of wind moving across the dry sand and little scrub bushes. The air was cold, but the sun was strong. My uncle was standing next to the stove, pouring coffee into his metal cup. He nodded at me, his eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses, and I nodded back. I stretched my arms high over my head and felt my ribs pop. Then I turned around to see the other 2 trailers. They were quiet. His friends were still sleeping. I walked over to the folding chair I left by the fire pit. It was empty, tipped slightly sideways in the dirt where I left it last night. I sat down and rubbed my face with my hands. My uncle walked over and set a cup of coffee down next to me without a word. The coffee burned my tongue, but it woke me up fast. I felt the caffeine crawl through my body, clearing away the heavy fog of sleep. I sat there, staring out at the open desert, feeling the silence press against my ears. It was always silent here. No cars, no people, nothing but wind and distant birds. I looked around the camp, checking the bikes lined up behind the trailers, the extra cans of gas, the helmets stacked neatly on a folding table. Everything was as we left it. The dirt was marked by our footprints and tire tracks, and little piles of trash bags were tied up next to each trailer, waiting to be packed back out. My uncle went to start the generator. It was behind his trailer, chained to the rear axle, so no one could steal it in the night. He bent down to fiddle with the choke and fuel line, and I watched him from my chair, sipping the bitter coffee. The sun rose higher, lighting up the brown dirt and small green bushes until everything looked like it was glowing slightly. My uncle pulled the cord, and the generator coughed to life, rattling and rumbling loud in the silence. That's when I saw something out of place. About 10 feet away, sitting in one of our folding chairs, was a man. I blinked hard and rubbed my eyes. The chair was next to the empty fire pit. The man was sitting with his back straight, hands resting on his knees, staring straight ahead at the desert. He was wearing a faded green army jacket, dirty jeans, and old work boots covered in dust. His hair was brown and messy, and his skin was tanned and rough. He wasn't moving at all, just sitting there, staring into the distance. I felt a sharp pain in my chest, like my lungs had locked up. My uncle was still behind the trailer, pulling cords and checking the fuel tank, and I just sat there frozen, staring at the man. I looked around, expecting to see a motorcycle or a truck nearby, but there was nothing. Just the trailers, the bikes, and miles of empty desert stretching out in every direction. I tried to think if I had seen him last night when we got here, but I knew I hadn't. I remembered carrying my sleeping bag, setting up my tent, eating instant noodles by the fire with my uncle and his friends. We sat there for hours, talking and laughing. There was no one else. And this morning, he wasn't there when I first sat down. The folding chair was empty. I stood up slowly, feeling the blood rush out of my head and my knees go weak. My boots crunched on the gravel as I shifted my weight. The man didn't move. He didn't even blink. I stared at his chest to see if he was breathing, and I saw it rise and fall, slow and steady. I felt sweat start to drip down my back despite the cold air. I turned and walked quickly over to my uncle behind the trailer. The generator was roaring, vibrating against the chain. He was busy messing with the extension cord, and I just stood there next to him, staring down at the dirt, trying to calm my breathing. When he finished, he looked up at me, his sunglasses reflecting my pale face. He raised his eyebrows, waiting for me to say something, but my mouth felt full of cotton. I swallowed hard and turned to look around the side of the trailer toward the fire pit. The chair was empty. The man was gone. My heart started pounding, so hard I thought I might faint. I walked out slowly to where the chair was. The dirt around it was smooth. No footprints, no scuffed marks, nothing. Just the folding chair sitting there, exactly as I left it last night. I bent down and touched the seat. It was cold from the morning air. I stood there, staring at the empty spot where he sat, trying to make sense of what I saw. My uncle walked up behind me, sipping his coffee, and looked at me with a frown. I shook my head and walked back to my tent, trying to calm the tremor in my hands. The rest of the morning was quiet. His friends woke up one by one and started cooking breakfast on their stoves. The smell of eggs and bacon filled the cold air, mixing with the smell of gasoline from the generator. I sat in my chair, staring at the desert, watching the sun climb higher until the rocks shimmered with heat. I kept looking at the chair across from me, expecting to see the man again, but it stayed empty. After breakfast, they started getting their bikes ready. My uncle checked tire pressure and refilled oil while his friends adjusted chains and wiped dust off the plastic fenders. I watched them from my chair, still feeling dazed and tired. I thought about telling my uncle what I saw, but I didn't want him to think I was crazy or tired or sick from the heat. I kept it to myself, and we spent the next hour packing extra tools and filling our water backpacks. When everyone was ready, we rode out into the desert. The engines roared and echoed off the hills, dust spraying out behind the tires as we tore through the dirt trails. I was riding my uncle's old Honda XR, feeling the suspension bounce under me as I hit small dips and rocks. The wind burned my face, drying my lips until they cracked and bled. I didn't care. Riding always made me feel alive, like I was flying low over the ground. We rode for hours, stopping only to drink water and check fuel levels. The sun climbed high above us, burning the top of my helmet until I could smell hot plastic. When we stopped for lunch under the small shade of an acacia tree, I felt the soreness in my thighs and arms from holding the bike steady over rough ground. We ate protein bars and trail mix, washing it down with warm water from our backpacks. I sat in the dirt, staring out at the rolling hills of the desert, thinking about the man I saw that morning. I wondered if he was real. Maybe he was just a tired traveler who wandered through the camps at dawn looking for help. But there were no footprints, no tire marks. No one saw him except me. I felt my chest tighten every time I thought about it. The way he just sat there, staring at nothing, as if he didn't even see me. After lunch, we rode further out to a dry riverbed where they liked to race each other. I sat on my bike, too tired to race, and watched them speed up and down the sandy bank, engines screaming as they dodged boulders and bushes. The sun was starting to fall lower in the sky, turning everything orange and gold. Long shadows stretched across the dirt, and the wind grew cooler. I felt the cold seep into my sweat-soaked shirt, making me shiver despite the heat. We rode back to camp as the sun set behind the hills. The ride back felt slower, quieter. Everyone was tired. My hands were blistered from gripping the handlebars all day, and my knees felt like they were filled with gravel. When we rolled into camp, I turned off my bike and just sat there, listening to the ticking of the cooling engine. The sky was darkening fast, and the cold air rushed in to replace the heat of the day. My uncle's friends lit the fire and started cooking dinner, opening cans of chili and beans, stirring them in little pots over the flames. I changed into clean clothes behind my tent, wiping the sweat and dust from my skin with baby wipes until the cloths came away brown with dirt. I pulled on a hoodie and sat by the fire, warming my hands, staring into the flames. The smoke burned my eyes, making them water, and I felt the tears roll down my dirty cheeks. I wiped them away before anyone noticed. They ate and drank beer and laughed about near crashes and tight corners from the day's ride. I forced myself to smile and laugh when they looked at me, but inside I felt hollow. Every time I looked at that folding chair across the fire, my chest tightened. I couldn't stop thinking about the man, where he came from, where he went. When the fire burned down to glowing embers, we crawled into our tents one by one. The desert was freezing by then. I pulled my sleeping bag tight around my shoulders and tucked my nose inside, listening to the generator's distant hum and the rustle of wind against the nylon walls. I lay there for hours, staring at the shadows of bushes against the tent fabric, thinking about him. I thought about waking up in the morning and seeing him there again, or seeing him standing right outside my tent waiting. My chest felt tight, my heart hammering against my ribs. I closed my eyes and told myself he was just a tired traveler. I woke up before my alarm went off that morning. The sun wasn't even out yet. My room felt cold, and I pulled the blanket up to my chin. I lay there for a while, listening to the sound of cars passing by far down the main road. I didn't feel like getting up, but I knew I had to. I had a long shift ahead at work. I stretched my legs under the blanket, feeling the stiffness in my knees from the day before. My back hurt a bit, maybe from the way I slept. I looked over at my phone. The screen was dark. I reached over to tap it, and it didn't light up. I pressed the power button harder, but still nothing. That was strange. I had charged it fully last night before bed. I set it back on the table and sighed. I thought maybe the charger wasn't plugged in right. I pushed my blanket off and swung my feet onto the cold floor. I shivered as the air hit my arms. I stood up, feeling the slight ache in my left heel as always, and walked over to where the charger was plugged in. It was there, plugged in fine. I unplugged it and plugged it back in. Still nothing on my phone screen. I felt annoyed. I had to leave for work by 7, and my phone was my only alarm. I walked into the kitchen and checked the microwave clock. It was flashing. The power must have gone out at some point during the night. I looked out the window. The sky was turning gray, but it was still too early for sunrise. I walked back into my room and opened my curtains a bit. The streetlights were still on outside, glowing orange and lighting up the empty street. I pulled on my sweatpants and a hoodie and sat on the edge of my bed, rubbing my eyes. I sat there for a while, thinking about work and how I needed to get groceries after my shift. I needed to buy eggs, bread, and maybe some instant coffee packs for the next few days. I felt tired already just thinking about it. I stood up and walked into the bathroom. The tiles felt cold under my feet. I turned on the light, and it flickered once before coming on fully. I brushed my teeth while looking at my reflection. My hair was sticking up on one side, and my eyes looked puffy. I splashed some cold water on my face and wiped it with a towel. I felt a little better. I decided to go outside to check the electric meter box. I thought maybe it had tripped during the night. I walked back into my room and put on socks and my old running shoes. I zipped up my hoodie and grabbed the flashlight from my drawer just in case. I stepped out the front door, and the cold air hit me properly this time. I breathed out and watched the cloud of steam float away. I walked around the side of the house to where the meter box was attached. The flashlight flickered once when I turned it on, but stayed steady after that. I opened the metal door and looked inside. All the switches were in place. I flipped the main switch off and on again. I waited. Nothing changed. I closed the meter box door and stood there for a moment, shining the flashlight around the small yard. The grass was wet with dew, and the neighbor's dog was barking far down the street. I could hear the faint noise of a car engine starting somewhere in the distance. I walked back inside, closing the door softly behind me. My stomach felt empty, and I realized I hadn't eaten anything since lunch the day before. I walked into the kitchen and opened the fridge. The light inside was off. I stood there staring at the rows of containers and bottles, feeling a little irritated. I grabbed the last orange juice bottle and took a sip. It was still cold, but not as cold as it should have been. I drank it slowly, leaning against the counter and staring at the dark screen of my phone lying on the kitchen table. After finishing the juice, I threw the empty bottle into the bin and stood there thinking about whether to go to work early and just charge my phone there. I decided I might as well. I grabbed my work bag and slung it over my shoulder. I checked the kitchen clock again, still flashing. I grabbed my car keys from the hook and walked out, locking the door behind me. The street was still quiet. The sky was turning lighter gray now, hinting at the morning that was about to start. I unlocked my car and got in, tossing my bag onto the passenger seat. I turned the key and the engine started, but the radio was silent. I pressed the power button, but nothing happened. I checked the dashboard display. It was off. My headlights worked though, so I just drove off carefully, feeling uneasy at how quiet the car felt without the radio humming in the background like it always did. The drive to work felt long even though it was only 15 minutes. I felt tense for some reason. Every time I stopped at a red light, I looked around at the other cars. There weren't many out yet, just delivery vans and 2 other cars I saw passing by. I reached my work building and parked in the side lot. I grabbed my bag and walked up to the door. The security lights above the door were off. I tried to open the door, but it was locked. I stood there for a moment. Usually the cleaning staff came in early and unlocked it by now. I pulled out my key card and tapped it against the sensor. Nothing. The small green light on the sensor was off. I stood there, looking through the glass. The inside of the office was dark, except for the faint early morning light coming through the windows on the far side. I felt this strange discomfort building up in my stomach. I turned and looked around the parking lot. It was empty. I walked back to my car and got in. I sat there for a long time, just holding my steering wheel. I didn't know what to do. My phone was dead. The office was locked. I felt isolated, sitting there in the quiet, with the world around me feeling paused. I decided to just sit and wait until someone arrived. I tilted my seat back a little and closed my eyes. The air inside the car was cold. I pulled my hoodie hood over my head and tucked my hands into the sleeves. I tried to relax, but my mind felt restless. I kept thinking about the power outage, my dead phone, and how nothing seemed to be working. After what felt like an hour, I sat up and looked outside. The sky was brighter now. I saw a person walking down the sidewalk on the far side of the parking lot. I watched them for a while. They walked with their head down, hands in their pockets. They passed by without looking towards me. I turned to look at the office building again. Still no lights on. I got out of my car and stretched my legs. I walked around to the back of the building to see if maybe the back door was open. As I walked along the side, I saw something that made me stop. One of the windows near the back was broken. Glass shards were scattered on the ground below it. I stood there staring at it for a long time. My chest felt tight. I walked closer, shining my flashlight into the window. Inside was the break room. The chairs were all pushed aside, and one of the tables was turned over. My throat felt dry. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on the broken glass. I walked around to the back door and tried it. It was unlocked. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The smell hit me immediately. It smelled like stale sweat and garbage. The air felt damp. I stood there listening. The whole place was silent. I walked in slowly, my shoes squeaking on the tiled floor. I walked past the storage room and into the main hallway. Everything was dark. I felt my chest tightening more with each step. I walked towards the break room to look in from the inside. The chairs were scattered everywhere. The fridge door was open, and a few snack wrappers were lying on the ground. The vending machine glass was shattered too. I felt my breathing getting faster. I stepped back into the hallway and stood there, trying to decide what to do. I walked towards my office section slowly, shining my flashlight ahead of me. As I passed by the locker area, I noticed one of the lockers was open. Clothes were spilling out of it. I didn't recognize the clothes. They looked dirty, old, and worn out. There were ripped jeans, a flannel shirt with a tear on the back, and a gray hoodie. I stepped closer and saw an old backpack lying on the floor under the locker. It looked dirty too, with stains on the bottom. I crouched down and opened it slowly. Inside were empty bottles, some food wrappers, and a roll of toilet paper. I felt my heart beating faster. I stood up and looked around, shining my flashlight at the ceiling and along the hallway. I walked back towards the main entrance. I felt this strong urge to leave. As I walked past the cleaning supply closet, I heard something. It was a faint rustling sound. I froze. I turned my head towards the closet door. The sound stopped. I stood there for a long time, staring at the door. My breathing felt loud in my chest. I took a step back, then another, keeping my flashlight pointed at the door. I felt my throat tightening. I turned and walked quickly back to the back door. I stepped outside into the cold air, my breath coming out in sharp clouds. I turned and shut the door softly behind me. I felt my hands shaking. I walked back to my car and got in, locking the doors. I sat there staring at the steering wheel, trying to calm down. My chest felt tight, and I felt lightheaded. I took slow breaths, trying to stop my hands from shaking. I turned the key in the ignition, but didn't drive off immediately. I just sat there, feeling the cold seat under me, feeling the stiffness in my neck. After a while, I put the car in reverse and backed out of the parking spot. I drove slowly out of the lot, looking at the building one last time. The broken window looked darker now as the morning light got brighter around it. I drove straight home, feeling my stomach turning the whole way. When I pulled into my driveway, I turned off the engine and sat there in silence. The sun was rising behind the trees, casting orange light onto my front yard. I felt tired. I grabbed my bag and walked up to my front door, unlocking it with shaking hands. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me, locking it carefully. I set my bag down and leaned against the door. My house felt cold and empty. I walked into my room and sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the floor. I sat there for a long time. I woke up that morning feeling tired. I hadn't slept well because of the heat inside my small room. I remember my sheets felt sticky against my back, and every time I rolled over, my body felt damp with sweat. The fan above me kept making a ticking sound all night, like something was loose in it. I kept thinking it was going to fall right onto my chest while I slept, and I guess that thought stuck in my head because I woke up almost every hour to check if it was still spinning above me. I sat up for a while after the sun started coming through my thin curtains, trying to get my head together. I knew I had a long day ahead. My boss wanted me to go check out a broken pipeline near an abandoned ranch that was about 40 minutes away from town. He told me to take my measuring tools, my notepad, and some replacement parts just in case it was something small that I could fix on the spot. I got out of bed slowly. My knees felt stiff. I walked barefoot across the cold cement floor to the bathroom and looked at myself in the mirror. My eyes looked puffy and my hair was sticking up in different directions. I splashed water on my face and felt a little better. After brushing my teeth, I went into the kitchen and made myself a quick breakfast. 2 slices of bread with peanut butter and half a glass of leftover milk from last night. I didn't feel like cooking eggs today. I packed some snacks into my bag, just in case I didn't find anywhere to eat near the ranch. A couple of granola bars, a banana, and a small bottle of juice. I also filled my thermos with water from the cooler. I picked up my measuring tape, my wrench set, and the metal box with the replacement valve parts. I walked out to my old pickup truck and put everything on the passenger seat. I stood there for a moment, feeling the morning sun on my arms. It was warm, but there was still a bit of cool air coming from the east. I took a deep breath and climbed into the truck. The drive was long and boring. The road was flat and empty for most of the way, with dry fields on both sides. Every now and then I saw old wooden fences with rusted wires drooping between them. Some parts of the fences had collapsed completely, and I could see yellow grass stretching far into the distance. The sky was clear and bright. I remember thinking it was going to be a hot day, even hotter than yesterday. I rolled down the windows to let the air in. The smell of dust and wild plants blew into the truck, mixing with the faint smell of engine oil and the leather seats. When I finally reached the turn-off road to the ranch, I slowed down. The gravel path was rough and uneven. My truck bounced over the stones, and I had to grip the steering wheel tightly to keep it steady. I could see the ranch buildings in the distance, surrounded by a line of old poplar trees. The trees were tall but thin, and their leaves looked dry and brittle. As I got closer, I saw that most of the buildings were falling apart. The barn roof had caved in on one side, and the main house had boarded up windows with graffiti sprayed across the front wall. There was an old metal water tank standing beside the barn, and a broken windmill nearby with its blades bent and rusted. I parked the truck near the gate and turned off the engine. For a few seconds, everything was silent except for the ticking sound of the cooling engine. I got out and grabbed my tools. The gate was hanging off its hinges, so I just stepped over it. The ground was covered in dry weeds and patches of dirt where nothing was growing. I made my way to the back of the property where the pipeline was supposed to be. The sun was already high above me, and the air felt hot against my skin. Flies buzzed around my face and landed on my arms, making me sweat at them every few seconds. I reached the area where the pipeline ran underground. There was a small cement structure with a metal hatch on top, probably built to access the valve system below. I set down my tools and knelt beside the hatch. I ran my hand across the metal surface, feeling the roughness of the rust patches. I could smell the old iron and dirt. I gripped the handle and pulled hard until it creaked open. A gust of cooler air rose from the opening, smelling like wet earth and old metal pipes. I took out my flashlight from my bag and shone it down into the hatch. I could see the top of the valve system and the first few steps of the metal ladder going down into the pit. The light reflected off small puddles of water on the concrete floor below. I put the flashlight between my teeth, grabbed the sides of the hatch, and lowered myself onto the ladder. The metal felt cool and slightly damp under my hands. I climbed down slowly, trying not to slip on the wet rungs. When I reached the bottom, the air felt heavy and humid. It smelled like old water and moss. I turned around and examined the valve system. There was a slow drip coming from one of the joints. Water was collecting below it, making a small dark puddle. I set down my bag and took out my wrench. I tightened the joint carefully, testing it after each turn to make sure I didn't damage the pipe. Once it felt secure, I wiped my forehead with my shirt sleeve. The dripping had stopped. I spent the next 20 minutes checking each connection to make sure there were no other leaks. The whole time I was down there, I kept hearing faint sounds above me. At first, I thought it was the wind moving through the trees, but there wasn't much breeze down here. The air felt still and quiet. I turned off my flashlight for a moment to save the battery while I packed my tools back into my bag. It was almost completely dark, except for the dim light coming from the hatch opening above me. I could see little particles of dust floating down through the beam of sunlight. When I climbed back up and stepped out of the hatch, I felt the hot sun hit my skin again. I took a deep breath of the dry air and stretched my back. My shirt was sticking to me with sweat. I closed the metal hatch and packed my tools back into my bag. As I stood up, I thought I heard something moving near the barn. I turned and looked but didn't see anything. The barn door was half open, swaying a little in the breeze. I shook my head and started walking back towards my truck. As I walked past the barn, I heard the sound again. This time it was clearer. It sounded like footsteps on the dirt, but very slow and careful. I stopped and listened. My ears were ringing from the quiet, and the buzzing flies made it hard to hear clearly. I took a few steps closer to the barn door and looked inside. The darkness inside felt heavy, like the shadows were clinging to everything. I couldn't see very far because the sunlight didn't reach the back of the barn. The smell of old hay, rotting wood, and animal droppings hit me immediately. I felt my stomach turn a little. I stood there for a few seconds, staring into the darkness. My eyes slowly adjusted, and I saw piles of old hay bales stacked along the sides, some of them collapsed and spilling out onto the ground. There were old wooden shelves with rusted tools and metal parts scattered across them. I didn't see anyone or anything moving, but I kept feeling like I was being watched. My chest felt tight, and I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. I told myself I was just imagining things, that maybe a raccoon or stray dog had gotten in through the broken wall at the back. I turned away and walked back towards my truck, but after only a few steps, I heard a louder sound. It was a deep thud, like something heavy dropping onto the barn floor. I stopped again and turned back. My mouth felt dry, and I swallowed hard. I didn't want to go back to check, but I also didn't want to leave without knowing what it was. I felt stupid for being so scared, but something about this place felt wrong. I walked back to the barn door slowly, stepping over old pieces of wood and metal lying in the dirt. I leaned against the door frame and looked inside again. My eyes were more adjusted to the dark now, and I could see further back. I saw an old tractor parked near the wall, its tires flat, and its seat covered in dust. Behind the tractor was a large pile of scrap metal and wooden planks. As I scanned the area, my eyes caught movement near the far corner. I squinted and focused on the spot. At first, I thought it was just a shadow moving with the breeze coming through the broken wall, but then I saw the shape more clearly. It was a man crouching near the ground. He was facing away from me, hunched over with his head down. His clothes were dirty and torn, and his hair was long and matted. His arms were wrapped around his knees, and he was rocking back and forth slightly. I felt a wave of cold run through my body. My legs felt weak, and I grabbed the door frame to steady myself. I didn't know what to do. My first thought was to ask if he needed help, but something about the way he was moving made my chest tighten with fear. There was no reason for someone to be sitting here like this, alone in an abandoned barn in the middle of nowhere. I backed away slowly, trying not to make any noise. My boots crunched on the dry dirt and small stones as I stepped back. I turned around and started walking quickly towards my truck. I felt like my legs weren't moving fast enough. My ears felt hot, and I could feel sweat dripping down my back. When I reached the truck, I threw my tools onto the passenger seat and climbed in. My hands were shaking as I put the key into the ignition. For a second, the engine struggled to start, and my heart felt like it was going to explode. Then it roared to life, and I gripped the steering wheel tightly. As I turned the truck around to drive back onto the gravel road, I glanced into my side mirror. I saw the barn door in the reflection. The man was standing there now, half hidden in the shadows, just watching me leave. His face was hidden behind his long hair, and he wasn't moving, just standing there with his arms hanging by his sides. I felt my throat tighten, and I pressed down on the gas pedal. The truck bounced over the gravel as I drove away, dust rising behind me in a thick cloud. I didn't slow down until I reached the main road. My hands were still shaking, and my chest felt heavy. I kept checking my mirrors for the next few miles, half expecting to see someone following me down the empty road. But there was no one, just the wide dry I had been waiting for that weekend for months. Work had been eating away at me, and my body felt tired all the time, like there was no blood running through my veins, just thick heaviness. So when my friend Daniel said he couldn't make it to the cabin trip, I didn't care. I told myself it would be even better alone. I could finally sit in silence, fish if I wanted to, sleep as long as I wanted, eat only when I felt like it, and not have to make conversation. Just me and the wind brushing through the pine trees, maybe some birds chirping, maybe the smell of firewood and old dirt. It sounded perfect in my head. The drive there felt nice at first. The road wound between green hills and wide open fields, and then turned into cracked asphalt hugging a wide river. Once I passed the last town, everything felt emptier. The grocery store was about an hour away from the cabin, so I made sure to stock up on water bottles, canned food, instant coffee, bread, and some snacks. I didn't want to drive back into town for anything. I filled up the car's tank and took a piss behind the building since their bathroom was locked. Then I started the car again and headed into the forest road that led to the cabin. The forest was thick there, not like city parks with neat trails. The trees rose tall and dark, covered in rough gray and brown bark. I could see where storms had broken off branches and left them hanging dead on the side of trunks. Some trees were twisted with age and pushed against others. Pine needles littered the ground everywhere. There was a kind of hush that I always forgot about, a quietness that made my chest feel calm. Only the tires crunching on gravel broke that silence as I drove up to the cabin. The cabin was small, old wood, dark from decades of weather, and a tin roof that had rust creeping up the edges. There was a small deck out front with a single plastic chair and a broom leaning against the wall. A pile of chopped wood sat near the door, covered with a dirty tarp weighed down by bricks. The lock on the door was stiff. I twisted the key hard until it clicked open and stepped inside. It smelled exactly the same as last time, stale air mixed with old firewood and mouse droppings. I could see some mouse turds along the baseboard near the sink, but I didn't care. I wasn't planning on using the sink much anyway. I dropped my backpack on the old dusty couch and carried in the rest of the groceries, lining them up on the little counter near the 2-burner propane stove. I pulled out a folding knife and opened a can of chili, poured it into a pot, and heated it up. I ate standing up, staring out the small window facing the trees, watching them sway a little in the breeze. There were some spider webs in the top corners of the window. I didn't touch them. When I finished eating, I rinsed out the pot with a splash of bottled water and left it upside down to dry. I stretched my back, cracked my knuckles, and went outside. The sun was still up, a few hours from setting. I decided to walk down to the river. It was about 15 minutes down a narrow trail. The path twisted between pine trees, and the ground was uneven, covered with roots that bulged up like knuckles under the dirt. I felt the fresh air filling my chest as I walked, the smell of earth and pine sap, so strong it almost made my teeth hurt. When I reached the river, it was running quick and cold, slapping up against rocks in white foam. I sat down on a big flat rock and watched the water move. I thought about nothing. I tried to feel the emptiness of the world there. No bosses, no deadlines, no stupid pointless meetings. Just water moving forever over stone. When the sun dipped lower, the temperature dropped fast. I headed back to the cabin before it got too dark to see the path. I kept an eye out for snakes, but didn't see any. At the cabin, I grabbed the broom and swept off the deck, knocking away dry pine needles and dirt clumps. Then I took the broom inside and swept out the mouse turds, pushing them into a dustpan and dumping them outside in the woods. The air smelled cooler now, the sky turning dark blue with thin streaks of orange between the trees. I lit a small fire in the metal fire pit outside and sat in the plastic chair, staring at the flames. My eyes felt heavy from the drive and the fresh air. I poked the fire a few times with a stick, making sparks fly up into the dark. I didn't hear anything except the small crackling and the faint rustling of branches above. When the fire died down to glowing coals, I poured some bottled water on it and watched the steam rise. Inside, I unrolled my sleeping bag on the couch and slipped inside. It was too quiet. I could hear every little sound. The creaking wood beams, the occasional tick of metal as the tin roof cooled. I closed my eyes and told myself to stop thinking. Stop thinking about work. Stop thinking about tomorrow. Just sleep. I woke up once around 2 in the morning needing to piss. I grabbed the flashlight, unzipped my sleeping bag, and stepped out into the cold night. The forest was black around me. I walked to the edge of the deck, down the 3 steps, and stood near the wood pile. I could hear the urine hitting the dry pine needles. The air felt cold against my skin. I finished and zipped up. As I turned to go back inside, I paused for a second. There was a smell. It smelled like sweat, like someone who hadn't bathed in weeks. Strong and sour. I lifted the flashlight and shone it around the trees. I didn't see anything, just the rough bark and deep shadows. My chest felt tight. I scanned a little longer, moving the light slowly back and forth. Nothing moved. I swallowed, turned around, went inside, locked the door, and lay back down. In the morning, the smell was gone. I told myself it was probably a dead animal, or maybe just the breeze carrying some rotting smell from deeper in the woods. I made some instant coffee and sipped it standing out on the deck, watching the morning fog drift between the trunks. I decided to hike up the old logging road past the river, deeper into the woods. I packed a water bottle, some trail mix, and my folding knife just in case. The road was rough, big stones and broken branches everywhere. My boots crunched over them as I walked. I could hear birds chirping high above, out of sight. I walked for about an hour until the road ended at a wide clearing. Old stumps sat there, gray and rotting, with moss growing up their sides. I stood there for a while, eating some trail mix, spitting shells onto the ground. The silence felt thick around me. I felt the hair on my neck stand up. I turned slowly, looking behind me, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved, but the feeling stayed. I headed back down the road, walking faster than before. My chest felt tight, like something was pushing against it from the inside. I kept looking back every few minutes. I tried to tell myself to calm down, but it didn't work. When I finally saw the roof of the cabin through the trees, I felt my shoulders drop in relief. I went inside, sat down on the couch, and drank half the water bottle in one go. The rest of the afternoon, I tried to read a paperback I had brought, but my eyes kept drifting to the window. I couldn't focus on the words. I kept thinking about the smell last night and the feeling in the clearing. I told myself I was just being paranoid. Too much city life, making me jumpy in real silence. Before sunset, I went out and gathered some fallen branches and dry twigs, stacking them by the fire pit for the evening fire. As I bent down to grab another branch, I heard a noise from the trees. It was a branch snapping. Not a little twig, but a thick, heavy snap, like someone stepping on a fallen log. I stood up straight, holding the branch in my hand like a club. My ears strained for any other sound. The wind rustled the branches high above. I didn't hear it again. I carried the branch to the pile and went back to the cabin, locking the door behind me. That night, I sat by the fire again. The flames made long shadows stretch out behind the trees. I kept looking into the woods, seeing shapes that weren't there, just shadows moving with the flickering firelight. I didn't stay out long. I poured water on the fire, waited until every coal was dark, and went inside. I locked the door, checked the windows, and crawled into my sleeping bag. I woke up again around midnight. I wasn't sure what woke me at first. Then I heard it. Footsteps outside. Slow, careful footsteps on the pine needles. Crunch, pause, crunch, pause, crunch. They moved along the side of the cabin, near the window facing the woods. I held my breath, my eyes wide open, staring up at the ceiling. I heard them stop right outside the window. I didn't move. My heart was pounding so hard I felt it in my throat. The footsteps didn't move for a long time. I could hear nothing but my own heartbeat and the small creaks of the cabin. Finally, I forced myself to move. I slid out of the sleeping bag as quietly as I could, picked up my flashlight, and crouched below the window. I waited. Then I flicked it on and jumped up, pointing it out the window. The beam cut through the darkness, lighting up the trees. Nothing was there. I kept the light steady, scanning side to side. No movement, no person, no animal, just empty forest and shadows. My hands were shaking. I turned off the flashlight, stepped back, and sat down on the couch, breathing hard. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat there, flashlight in my lap, listening. Once I heard an owl hoot far off, but nothing else came close. When the sun finally rose, I felt like my bones were filled with sand, heavy and aching. I made coffee and sat on the deck, staring into the trees. The calm morning felt unreal after the fear of the night. I kept thinking about those footsteps, how slow they were, how they paused between each step. I tried to tell myself it was an animal, but it didn't sound like an animal. It sounded like a person trying to move quietly. I spent the morning packing up my stuff. I didn't feel relaxed anymore. I felt watched, like there were eyes. I woke up before sunrise that morning. The inside of my tent was cold, and I could feel the thin sleeping pad underneath me pressing into my hip bone. My neck was stiff from sleeping on my rolled-up hoodie. I reached for my phone to check the time. It was 4:37 a.m. I laid there for a while listening to the forest around me. It was quiet except for the light breeze moving through the trees, making that rustling sound that always made me feel uneasy when I was alone. I hadn't really slept well all night. Every little sound felt louder in the dark, and even though I was exhausted from hiking all day, my mind wouldn't settle down enough to let me sleep deeply. The first light started to show through the thin fabric of my tent, and I decided there was no point in trying to go back to sleep. I unzipped my sleeping bag and put on my damp socks and hiking shoes. My shoes were cold from the night dew. I opened the tent slowly, trying not to make too much noise. The air was crisp, and I could see my breath faintly. My campsite was about a mile off the main trail, next to a small stream. I had chosen this spot because it was hidden behind some boulders and trees, and I liked feeling away from everyone. But in the early morning darkness, it felt more isolating than comforting. I stretched my arms above my head and looked around. The forest floor was covered with fallen pine needles and small branches. Everything was tinted in shades of gray and blue before the sun rose. I walked over to my bear bag, which I had hung from a tree about 50 feet from the tent. I checked the knot and lowered it down carefully. It felt heavier than I remembered, but I thought maybe I had packed it unevenly. I took out an energy bar and some trail mix and sat down on a flat rock to eat. The cold rock seeped through my pants, but I didn't want to sit on the damp ground. While I chewed, I listened to the forest slowly waking up. A few birds chirped in the distance. I thought about the day ahead. I had planned to hike another 12 miles to reach a lake where I wanted to camp that night. I felt a small ache in my knees thinking about the long day ahead. I finished eating and packed up my food. As I was tightening the bear bag ropes to hang it back up, I heard a snap of a branch deeper in the trees behind me. I froze for a second and turned my head slowly. I couldn't see anything moving, and I told myself it was probably just a deer. I stood there for a few more seconds, listening. Nothing. I shook my head and tried to laugh at myself, but the sound didn't really come out. I felt my chest tighten a bit. I quickly hoisted the bag back up and tied it off, then walked back to my tent. I decided to pack up everything and get an early start. I rolled up my sleeping bag, stuffed my clothes into the bottom of my pack, and took down my tent. The process felt slower than usual because I kept stopping to look over my shoulder. It felt like someone was watching me, but I couldn't see anything. The feeling made me rush even though I tried to stay calm. When I had everything packed, I stood there for a moment with my hands on my hips, just looking around. The sun was rising now, casting weak yellow light through the trees. My stomach felt tight. I adjusted my pack on my shoulders and started walking toward the main trail. My boots crunched on the dry pine needles, and every step sounded too loud in the quiet morning. As I walked, I tried to shake the nervous feeling off. I told myself it was just being alone in the woods that made me uneasy, and there was nothing to be worried about. About 20 minutes later, I reached the main trail and turned north. The forest was denser here, and the trees grew taller. Sunlight came through in narrow beams, illuminating floating dust and pollen. It looked peaceful, but the feeling in my chest hadn't gone away. I kept glancing behind me every few minutes. At some point, I stopped to take a sip of water from my bottle, and when I looked down, I noticed fresh footprints in the dirt next to mine. They weren't from boots like mine. They looked like running shoes. The tread was different. I bent down to look closer. The prints were facing the same direction as mine, but looked fresher, like someone had just walked here this morning. I stood up quickly and scanned the trail ahead. I couldn't see anyone, but the trail curved slightly to the left about 50 feet away, and thick undergrowth lined both sides. I swallowed hard. My mouth felt dry even though I had just drunk water. I started walking again, this time trying to walk as quietly as I could. My breathing felt louder than my steps. The trail started to incline, and my thighs burned with each step uphill. I tried to focus on my breathing and ignore the feeling of being watched. After about an hour, I stopped again to eat another energy bar and rest my legs. I sat down on a fallen tree and took off my pack. The woods were silent again, except for the occasional bird call. I unwrapped the bar and took a bite. The taste was bland, but I chewed slowly to make it last longer. As I sat there, I noticed movement through the trees to my right. My heart jumped, and I stared hard at the spot. I saw a dark shape between the trunks. It wasn't moving like an animal. It was standing still. I squinted, trying to see better, but the morning sun was shining directly into my eyes at that angle. I blinked a few times, and then it was gone. I stood up quickly and put the rest of the bar in my pocket. I grabbed my pack and started walking again, faster this time. My chest felt tight, and my ears felt like they were ringing slightly. I walked for about another hour without stopping. I kept glancing back every few minutes. My hands felt sweaty even though the morning air was cool. When I reached a small clearing where the sunlight poured in, I stopped in the middle of it and turned in a full circle, scanning every inch of the tree line. Nothing moved, but the feeling of being watched was stronger here. I stood there for a long time, just breathing and listening. The breeze picked up slightly, rustling the leaves. I could hear my heart beating in my ears. After a while, I forced myself to keep walking. I wanted to reach the lake by early afternoon so I could set up camp in daylight. The The trail narrowed again, winding between thick bushes and low tree branches. I ducked under them as I walked, trying not to snag my pack. I was so focused on looking behind me that I didn't see the fallen branch across the trail until I tripped over it. I fell forward hard, my hands scraping against the rough dirt and small rocks. Pain shot up my left wrist, where I caught most of my weight. I sat up slowly, wincing. I checked my wrist. It wasn't broken, but it hurt when I moved it. I looked around me as I sat there on the trail, trying to catch my breath. I felt exposed sitting there. I stood up quickly despite the pain and brushed the dirt off my pants. I adjusted my pack and kept walking, this time paying more attention to the trail in front of me. About an hour later, I came to a fork in the trail. My map showed that both paths would eventually meet up again, but one was slightly longer and followed the edge of a deep ravine. I didn't want to walk near the ravine because the idea of slipping down into it scared me, especially alone. I chose the shorter path to the left. As I walked, I noticed the forest here was darker. The trees grew close together, and the sunlight barely reached the ground. The air felt damp, and the smell of wet soil was strong. I walked for about 15 minutes when I heard footsteps behind me. I froze. The sound stopped instantly. I turned around slowly. There was nothing there. My breathing was shallow, and my fingers felt numb. I listened hard. Silence. I turned back and kept walking, but the feeling that someone was behind me wouldn't go away. Every few minutes, I thought I heard a twig snap or the soft crunch of leaves underfoot. I started walking faster. My shoulders hurt from the tension of keeping my pack straps tight, and my head turning constantly. After what felt like forever, I saw the trail start to brighten ahead. I walked faster toward the light until I stepped out into another clearing. This one was smaller than the last, with a circle of rocks where someone had built a fire pit before. I dropped my pack next to the fire pit and sat down on one of the rocks. My back was damp with sweat despite the cool air. I pulled out my water bottle and drank half of it in one go. My wrist throbbed dully, but I ignored it. I just wanted to rest for a few minutes before pushing on to the lake. As I sat there, I heard footsteps again, this time coming from the trail I had just walked down. My stomach clenched, and I felt my hands start to shake. The footsteps were slow and steady, moving closer. I stood up quickly and grabbed my pack. I slung it over my shoulders and walked into the trees on the opposite side of the clearing, crouching down behind a large bush. My heart was beating so hard I felt dizzy. A few seconds later, a man walked into the clearing. He was wearing dark clothes, and his hood was pulled up over his head, even though the morning was getting warmer now. He stopped in the middle of the clearing and looked around slowly. I felt my body shaking as I crouched there. He walked over to where I had been sitting and bent down, looking at the dirt where my footprints were. He reached out and touched the rock I had been sitting on. Then he stood up and just stood there, staring into the trees. I didn't move. I barely breathed. My thighs burned from squatting so low, and my knees felt like they would give out. The man stood there for what felt like forever. Then he turned and walked to the other side of the clearing, disappearing into the trees. I stayed crouched there, shaking. I waited for at least 10 minutes, listening hard. When I couldn't hear anything anymore, I stood up slowly. My legs felt weak, and I had to hold onto the bush to keep from falling over. I put my head against the rough trunk of a tree and closed my eyes. My breathing was ragged. I knew I couldn't stay there. I needed to keep moving and put as much distance as I could between me and that man. I forced myself to start walking again, staying off the trail for a while. I moved through the undergrowth, my pack catching on. I woke up earlier than everyone else that morning. The sky was still dark blue, just starting to lighten near the horizon. We were camping at a small spot by a river, hidden behind a line of trees off a dirt road. My back hurt from sleeping on the cold ground, even though I had used my folded hoodie under the sleeping bag as a pillow. I sat up slowly, feeling the tightness in my shoulders and neck. My friends were still asleep in their tents, zipped up completely. I could hear faint snoring from David's tent and the rustling of someone turning over in another. The fire pit in the middle of our site was cold and dead, surrounded by empty camping chairs and 2 coolers with ice melted overnight. I stood up and stretched. The morning air felt sharp and cold on my skin. I walked to the river's edge, stepping carefully over rocks and twigs, feeling them dig into the thin sole of my old trainers. The river was calm and flat, moving just enough to break the reflection of the dark sky into ripples. My breath came out in clouds that drifted over the water before disappearing. I wanted to wash my face to wake up properly. I bent down, cupped my hands in the water, and splashed it on my face. The cold burned for a second, and then settled, making me shiver. I did it again just to feel fully awake. As I stood up straight, wiping my hands on my track pants, I looked across the river. There was a narrow clearing there, leading into thicker trees beyond. It looked gray and empty, just shadows and early morning light mixing together. For a second I thought I saw something move between two trees, but when I focused, there was nothing. Probably just a bird, or my eyes adjusting from sleep. I turned back to camp and checked my phone. No signal, only the time glowing on the cracked screen. 5:31 a.m. The battery was at 12%. I didn't want it to die yet, so I turned it off and slid it into my jacket pocket. I walked slowly around the campsite, picking up wrappers and cans we left out last night. There were beer cans near the fire pit, energy drink cans under the chairs, and a couple of empty chip bags flattened by footsteps. I didn't want animals coming in while everyone slept. After tidying up a bit, I went to the car parked a few feet away. I opened the back seat and took out a bottle of water and a banana. I sat on the hood of the car, peeling the banana and eating it slowly. The metal under me felt cold, even through my pants. As I ate, I looked up at the sky again. It was getting brighter, turning from dark blue to gray with hints of pale yellow. Birds had started calling out in the trees, high-pitched short whistles echoing all around. When I finished eating, I jumped off the car and tossed the peel into a trash bag hanging off the tent pole. I decided to walk a little to loosen up my back. I put on my jacket properly, zipped it up to my chin, and started walking down the dirt road away from camp. My shoes crunched softly on the gravel. The road curved slowly along the side of the river, and to my left there was nothing but thick forest going uphill. I kept my eyes on the road ahead, stepping over potholes filled with rainwater from 2 days ago. The air smelled damp and earthy, mixed with a faint sweetness from the trees. I could hear the river moving quietly to my right. The road was empty, no cars, no bikes, just silence and bird calls echoing from deep in the trees. I walked for what felt like 20 minutes, my hands tucked in my jacket pockets. Every now and then, I kicked a small stone off the road into the bushes. At one point, I stopped to listen. I didn't hear anything unusual, just the forest sounds. I turned around, planning to go back to camp before everyone woke up. As I walked back, I glanced up the hill into the trees on my left. There was an old path going up, barely visible under dead leaves and small rocks. It looked like no one had walked it in months, maybe years. The curiosity in me felt stronger than my caution. I knew I had time before anyone woke up. I decided to walk up that path just a bit to see where it led. I stepped off the road and onto the trail. The ground felt uneven under my feet, small roots catching my shoes as I moved up slowly. My breathing grew heavier as the path steepened. I pushed past thin branches hanging into the trail, their wet leaves brushing against my arms. A few meters up, the path curved to the left and opened into a small clearing. There were old tree stumps there, cut long ago, and dead branches scattered around. I stood still, listening to the forest breathe around me. It felt colder up here, with no sun reaching through the thick tree cover. In the middle of the clearing, there was a rusted metal barrel standing upright. The paint was almost gone, and rust flakes covered the ground around it. It looked like someone had burned trash in it years ago. I walked closer, stepping carefully over fallen branches. As I reached the barrel, I saw ashes and half-burnt pieces of wood inside, covered with dry leaves. I kicked the side gently, and it rocked slightly, making a hollow metallic sound that echoed into the trees. I looked around again, turning in a slow circle. The trees stood silent and dark, the trunks thick with moss. I could hear drops of water falling from high branches onto the leaves below. The air smelled strong and green here, mixed with the faint metallic smell from the barrel. As I stood there, I felt uneasy. Something about the place felt off. I didn't want to stay long. I decided to head back down. As I turned towards the trail, I froze. On the ground near the edge of the clearing, half covered in leaves, was a backpack. It was dark blue, almost black with dampness. I walked towards it slowly, feeling my heart beat faster. I knelt down and brushed the leaves off it. The zippers were closed but rusted at the ends. The fabric was torn in places, showing gray foam padding inside. I reached out and unzipped the front pocket. Inside, There was a small flashlight with corroded batteries and an old granola bar, the wrapper chewed open at the corner by mice or bugs. I zipped it back up and stood looking around. Who left it here? Why did they never come back for it? My chest felt tight with a nervous energy, and I decided I didn't want to be up there anymore. I started walking quickly down the trail, stepping over rocks and roots, feeling my breathing go shallow. I felt watched, though I saw nothing around me. The forest felt too quiet now, like all the birds had stopped calling at once. I tried to shake the feeling off, focusing on each step. When I reached the dirt road, I almost sighed out loud with relief. I turned back towards camp and walked fast, wanting to get back to where my friends were. When I reached camp, the sun was higher, lighting up the trees in golden patches. I saw David sitting by the dead fire pit, rubbing his eyes. 2 others were coming out of their tents, stretching and yawning. I walked to my tent and sat inside, trying to calm my mind. I didn't want to tell them about the backpack yet. It didn't feel right to talk about it. We spent the day cooking breakfast on the small stove, frying eggs and toasting bread. We packed some snacks into our day packs and planned to go fishing at a lake about half a mile upriver. I tried to act normal, but the thought of the backpack and the empty clearing stuck in my mind like a splinter under skin. Every time I zoned out, I saw that rusted barrel and the torn backpack lying there alone. Around noon, we started walking upriver. The path was narrow and overgrown in places, forcing us to step carefully to avoid sliding into the water. The sun was hot now, burning the top of my head, even through my cap. My shirt stuck to my back with sweat. We walked in a single file, ducking under branches and stepping over roots. The river beside us glowed in the sun, bright and blinding where it broke through the trees. When we reached the lake, we sat on a fallen log and unpacked our snacks. The lake was small, surrounded by tall trees and reeds at the edge. The water was calm, with dragonflies darting over the surface. We set up our fishing rods and cast our lines in silence. Time passed slowly, broken only by the hum of insects and the occasional splash of fish jumping out of reach. As I sat there, holding my rod, my mind drifted back to the backpack again. I wondered if someone had gone missing here years ago. I wondered if their family ever knew where they had gone. I pictured them walking up the trail alone, leaving their backpack behind, and never walking back down. A cold shiver ran through me even though the sun was hot. I rubbed my arms and tried to focus on the lake instead. We spent 2 hours there, catching nothing. By the time we packed up, clouds were rolling in from the west, dark and heavy. We walked back fast, hoping to reach camp before the rain started. The wind picked up, making the trees sway and creak above us. I felt an urgency in my chest, wanting to be back near the tents, near the car, away from that trail. That evening, it rained hard. We sat in our tents, listening to it drum on the thin fabric. The ground grew muddy under the rain, water pooling in small hollows around the site. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring at the tent ceiling as lightning flashed outside, turning the gray nylon white for split seconds. Thunder followed each flash, making my chest vibrate with the low rumble. When the rain stopped late at night, I unzipped my tent and stepped out. The forest smelled fresh and wet. Water dripped from the trees in a steady rhythm. The moon was out, half hidden behind thin clouds. I walked to the river, wanting to clear my mind before sleeping again. The water moved dark and smooth under the moonlight. I stood there for a while, listening to frogs croaking somewhere downstream. As I turned back to camp, I looked up the dirt road towards where that old path started. Even in the moonlight, I could see the gap in the trees leading up into darkness. I felt a chill run through me, and I quickly walked back to my tent. The next morning, we packed up to leave. We folded our tents, rolled up our sleeping bags, and loaded everything into the car. I woke up at 4:42 a.m. My phone was on the small wooden table beside my sleeping bag, glowing dimly in the darkness. The tent was cold and silent, except for the slow drip of condensation rolling down the inside walls. I didn't hear any birds yet, just the emptiness of that early hour before dawn. I lay there for a few minutes, staring at the dark nylon ceiling, feeling the cool morning air on my face. My neck was stiff from the lumpy ground. I turned my head to look at my friend's sleeping bag. He was curled up inside it, facing away from me, still breathing slow and heavy. I felt jealous that he was asleep while I was stuck awake listening to my heartbeat and the ringing silence of the pine forest. Eventually, I unzipped the bag and forced myself to sit up. My knees cracked as I folded them, pulling on my sweatpants that I had used as a pillow. The floor of the tent was gritty with sand and dried pine needles. I slid my shoes on, feeling the cold rubber soles against my bare feet. The tent zipper was loud when I pulled it down. I stepped outside, my breath steaming in front of me, and stood for a moment to stretch. The world was still dark, but getting lighter in the east. The sky above the tree line had turned deep gray with a pale blue strip along the horizon. I walked away from the tent into the trees to pee, picking a spot behind a thick trunk so no one would see me if they woke up. As I stood there, I could hear the quiet breeze up high, moving softly through the pine needles, but there was no wind at my level. When I finished, I shook out my legs and walked further into the trees, deciding to take a short walk to warm up before making breakfast. I didn't tell anyone I was going. I didn't think I needed to. We had camped in a national forest an hour from the nearest town. We drove down a dirt road until it ended at a gate, then hiked about 2 miles into the woods where we set up camp in a flat clearing near a dry creek bed. There was nothing out here except trees, brush, and rocks. I walked slowly, feeling my muscles loosen as I moved. My ankles felt tight, and every step hurt until the stiffness faded away. The forest floor was covered in fallen pine needles that muffled my footsteps. I could smell the sap in the air, strong and earthy, mixing with the cold dampness of morning. As I moved further away from camp, the sky grew brighter, revealing the thin trunks around me stretching high overhead. I felt calm. I liked being alone early in the morning, before everyone else woke up. It made me feel like the world belonged to me for a little while. I kept walking until I reached a small rocky rise where the ground climbed up and exposed pale stones covered in green moss and lichen. I climbed up and stood at the top. From there I could see over the low trees to the east. The sun hadn't come up yet, but the sky was glowing pale orange at the horizon. I stood there breathing in the cold air, feeling it fill my lungs and chill the back of my throat. My nose was running from the cold. I wiped it on the back of my hand and sniffed hard. After a while I decided to head back to camp and make coffee before the others woke up. I turned around to walk back down the rocky slope. As I did, I heard a noise behind me. It was just a soft crack, a twig snapping somewhere in the trees below. At first I ignored it. Animals move around all the time in the woods. But then I heard another noise, another snap, then a crunch like something stepping on pine cones. I stood still for a moment, listening hard. My ears rang with silence when I held my breath. I looked around slowly. The trees were dense below the rocky rise. Thin trunks spaced close together with clusters of brush between them. I couldn't see anything moving, but I felt my skin crawl with the sense that someone was there, just out of sight. I told myself it was a deer, maybe a rabbit, but it sounded heavy. I couldn't hear breathing or rustling, only those few quiet steps, and then nothing. I started walking back down toward camp. My feet moved quickly but quietly over the pine needles. As I moved, I kept glancing over my shoulder, checking behind me. The feeling didn't go away. It got stronger the closer I got to camp. Like something was keeping pace with me, matching my movements but staying hidden. Every few seconds I heard another small crack or crunch behind me, always stopping when I stopped to listen. The back of my neck prickled with cold fear. I started to imagine someone following me, keeping just out of view behind the trees, watching me. My chest felt tight, and my breathing grew shallow and fast. I told myself again it was just an animal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being hunted. When I reached camp, I stepped into the clearing and stopped. I turned around quickly, scanning the trees. They were silent and empty. I didn't hear any more noises. The sky had turned pale blue now, and I could see better between the trunks. Nothing moved. I felt embarrassed for feeling scared, but my heart was still pounding hard. I went to the fire pit and crouched down to build a small fire. My fingers were stiff from the cold as I arranged the sticks and pine needles. I struck a match and lit the pile, blowing on it gently until the flame caught. As I warmed my hands, I kept glancing at the edge of the trees. I still felt watched. My friend eventually woke up and crawled out of the tent, rubbing his eyes and yawning. He walked over to the fire and sat down heavily on a log. He looked tired and didn't say anything. I started boiling water in our small camping kettle and poured it into 2 mugs with instant coffee packets. We drank in silence, listening to the birds that had finally started calling in the trees. I didn't tell him about what I heard. I didn't want him to think I was paranoid. After we ate breakfast, we packed up our sleeping bags and gear. We had planned to hike further into the forest to another campsite about 6 miles away. I kept feeling uneasy, but I didn't say anything. We finished packing, loaded our backpacks, and set off down the narrow trail that led deeper into the woods. The trail was rough, winding between thick tree trunks with roots snaking across it like veins. My backpack was heavy, pressing down on my shoulders and hips, making my legs ache with every step. The sun was up now, casting sharp slanting beams through the trees and lighting up floating dust and pollen in the air. Birds flew back and forth across the trail. Squirrels chattered in the branches above us. The normal forest sounds calmed me down for a while, and I started to think I had imagined everything earlier. But about an hour into the hike, I started hearing noises again. Small cracks, rustling brush, a faint crunch of footsteps off to the side. Every time I stopped, the noises stopped. My friend kept walking ahead, his boots thudding softly on the dirt trail. I felt like I was being watched from the trees. My heart pounded louder each time I heard something move. We came to a small clearing with a fallen tree across the trail. My friend climbed over it and kept going. When I stepped onto the log, I heard a heavy snap of a branch breaking somewhere to my left. I froze. My eyes scanned the forest, but I didn't see anything. I quickly climbed over the log and hurried to catch up. The noises followed us for miles. Always off to the side, never directly behind us. I felt sick with fear, but didn't want to say anything. My friend stopped once to pee, stepping off the trail behind a thick clump of bushes. I stood there alone, gripping my backpack straps, staring into the trees. I saw something move between two trunks about 30 feet away. Just a quick flash of dark shape moving behind the trees. My throat went dry. My stomach clenched. My skin turned cold, even though I was sweating. I didn't tell my friend when he came back to the trail. I just kept walking, moving faster now. My calves burned and my shoulders ached, but I didn't care. I wanted to get to the next campsite as soon as possible. We reached the site in the early afternoon. It was an open flat area surrounded by dense trees with a small trickling creek running along one side. We dropped our packs and sat down on a large flat rock near the water. I drank half my water bottle in one go, the cold liquid running down my throat feeling like relief. My friend started setting up the tent while I walked to the edge of the trees to collect firewood. As I picked up fallen sticks and small branches, I kept glancing around, feeling that crawling sensation on my skin again. When I stood up with an armful of wood, I saw a shape between the trees about 50 feet away. At first I thought it was a stump, but then it moved slightly. It looked like a person crouching down, just staring at me. I froze. My chest felt like it was being squeezed. I stood there holding the wood, not breathing. The shape didn't move again. I blinked hard, my eyes watering from staring. When I opened them, I didn't see it anymore. Just empty trees and brush. I backed away slowly, then turned and walked quickly back to camp. My friend had finished setting up the tent and was starting to lay out the sleeping bags. I dropped the firewood in a pile by the pit. My hands were shaking. I didn't say anything. I helped him gather more wood and set up our small propane stove for dinner. That evening we sat by the fire, eating dehydrated pasta out of our metal bowls. The sun set behind the trees, and darkness came fast. The air turned cold, and the forest filled with the quiet sounds of insects and distant owl calls. I kept glancing into the darkness between the trees. Every shadow looked like a person crouching and watching us. We stayed up until the fire burned down to glowing red coals. My friend went to the tent first. I sat there alone, staring into the dying fire, feeling the heat on my face and the cold night air on my back. My eyes burned with exhaustion. I felt like if I stayed up any longer I'd collapse. I finally stood up and kicked dirt over the coals until they stopped glowing. I walked to the tent and unzipped the door. As I stepped inside, I heard a noise behind me, just a small crunch. I woke up before sunrise that morning. The cold air inside my small tent felt sharp against my cheeks, and when I unzipped my sleeping bag, a chill ran down my back. I stayed still for a minute, listening to the quiet. There was no wind yet, no rustling leaves or chirping birds, just silence. My breath rose in little clouds as I sat up and rubbed my face to wake myself up fully. I pulled on my fleece hoodie and unzipped the tent slowly to not wake the others. We had set up camp late last night after hiking all day up the ridge trail. The ground outside was covered with a thin layer of frost, and it crunched under my boots as I stepped out. I walked a few feet away from the tents to stretch and looked around. The sun wasn't up yet, but the sky was turning a dark blue, hinting at dawn coming soon. I didn't feel tired, even though I hadn't slept well. I felt restless instead, like my body needed to move. My legs felt heavy from the hike, and my shoulders ached from carrying my pack, but my mind was awake and alert. I decided to go get water before anyone else woke up. The creek wasn't far, just down a small slope and through some thick bushes about 50 yards from camp. I grabbed my water bottles, put on my gloves, and started walking. The frost made the grass slippery under my boots, and a few times I had to grab a tree trunk to keep from sliding down. My gloves got wet and cold, but I didn't mind it. The cold helped me stay sharp. As I reached the bottom of the slope, I could hear the creek flowing, quiet but steady, breaking the silence of the forest. The air near the creek felt colder. I crouched down by the water and dipped my bottles in one by one. The freezing water stung my fingers. I kept glancing around, looking at the trees and bushes for any movement. There were bear tracks near the water last evening when we set up camp, so I didn't want to be caught off guard. When the bottles were filled, I screwed the caps on tight and stood up to stretch my back. I took a deep breath and smelled the wet earth and cold water mixed with the faint scent of pine. I felt calm standing there, listening to the water flow and feeling the cold air on my face. I turned around to walk back up to camp, feeling good about getting a small job done before the others woke up. Halfway up the slope, I heard something. It wasn't loud, just a faint snapping of a twig or a branch, but it sounded close. I stopped walking and listened. At first, there was nothing. The forest was quiet like before. I took a few more steps, and there it was again, a snap, this time from my left, deeper in the trees. I felt my chest tighten a little, and I turned my head slowly to look. I couldn't see anything through the thick brush and trees. I tried to calm myself down by thinking it could be a deer or a small animal. I kept walking, but I walked a little faster this time, pushing my boots hard into the ground to keep from slipping. I wanted to get back to camp quickly. As I reached the top of the slope and saw the tents through the trees, I felt my shoulders relax a bit. I walked back to my tent and placed the water bottles inside. The sun was peeking over the ridge now, and the frost on the ground was starting to melt, turning to small beads of water on the grass. I decided to make some coffee before everyone woke up. I set up my small camping stove on a flat rock, lit it carefully, and placed my metal mug on top to heat up some water. I poured in the instant coffee powder and stirred it slowly with a spoon, watching the steam rise up into the cold air. As I sipped my coffee, I kept thinking about that sound I heard near the creek. My stomach felt uneasy even though I was trying to ignore it. I sat on a fallen log and looked around camp. Everything was still quiet. The tents were zipped up, and the others were still sleeping. The forest felt calm, but my mind wasn't. About 30 minutes later, I heard movement inside one of the tents, and soon my friend Brian unzipped it and stepped out. He stretched his arms high and yawned, then saw me sitting there with coffee. He walked over slowly, rubbing his eyes, and sat next to me. I handed him the rest of my coffee and told him I'd make another cup for myself. We didn't talk much, just sat there drinking coffee and looking at the trees as the sun rose higher, lighting up the forest floor. Soon, the rest of the group started waking up one by one, and the quiet camp turned into sounds of zippers opening, people coughing, and the clicking of stoves being lit. I felt better being surrounded by everyone again. The uneasy feeling from earlier faded into the background. After breakfast, we started packing up camp. We planned to hike another 6 miles to reach the next campsite near the old fire lookout. I rolled up my sleeping bag, folded my tent, and strapped everything tightly to my pack. As I lifted it onto my shoulders, the weight pulled me down a little, but I tightened the hip belt and chest strap to balance it out. We started hiking around 9. The trail was narrow and rocky, winding through dense forest with patches of sunlight breaking through the tall pine trees. The air felt cool and fresh, and the forest smelled strong with pine and earth. I walked behind Brian, keeping a steady pace. The group spread out along the trail, as some people slowed down to adjust their packs or drink water. After about 2 hours of hiking, we reached a small clearing with big rocks scattered around. We decided to take a break there. I dropped my pack on the ground, feeling the sweat soaking the back of my shirt. I sat on a flat rock, pulled off my boots to let my feet breathe, and drank half a bottle of water in one go. My legs felt sore but strong. I looked around while resting. The trees in this area were taller, with thick trunks covered in dark green moss. The sunlight came down in golden beams, lighting up dust particles floating in the air. It looked beautiful, but it also felt quiet in a heavy way. I kept scanning the tree line, looking for any movement, remembering the sounds I heard this morning. After 15 minutes, we started hiking again. The trail climbed higher, and soon we were walking along a narrow ridge with steep drops on both sides. I felt my legs burn with each step, but I kept my head down and focused on my boots, placing them carefully so I wouldn't slip. Around noon, we stopped for lunch near a fallen tree. I pulled out a tortilla, smeared some peanut butter on it, and ate it slowly, staring at the ground. I felt tired, but it was a calm tiredness. I finished eating and stood up to stretch my back. When I turned around to look at the forest behind me, I froze. About 50 feet away, behind a tree, I saw a person standing there. My chest tightened immediately. The person wasn't wearing any hiking gear or backpack. They had on dark clothes that looked dirty, and they were just standing there, half hidden behind the tree trunk, watching us. I felt my skin go cold. My mind started racing, trying to understand what I was seeing. Who would be standing out here alone with no gear? I kept staring, not blinking, afraid that if I blinked they would disappear or move closer without me seeing. After a few seconds, the person stepped back behind the tree, and I couldn't see them anymore. I felt my legs shake slightly. I looked around at my friends, but everyone was busy packing up their lunch stuff, talking quietly, not noticing anything strange. I kept staring at the tree line, waiting for the person to come out again, but they didn't. I felt my stomach twist in fear, and I felt angry at myself for feeling scared. I didn't want to say anything to the group because I didn't want to sound paranoid, but my body felt on edge. We started hiking again soon after. The trail moved away from the ridge and back into the thick forest. As we walked, I kept looking over my shoulder every few minutes, expecting to see someone following us, but there was no one. The forest felt too quiet, like all the birds and animals had disappeared. Around 3 in the afternoon, we reached the old fire lookout. It was a small wooden tower with rusty metal stairs leading up to the top platform. The windows were dusty and cracked, and the roof looked like it was sagging. We decided to set up camp near the base of the tower, since there was a flat clearing with enough space for our tents. I dropped my pack on the ground and stretched my arms high, feeling my shoulders pop. My shirt was soaked with sweat, and I could feel the salt crusting on my skin. I drank some water and walked around the clearing to check the area before setting up my tent. As I walked near the tree line, I saw footprints in the soft dirt. They were shoe prints, but not from hiking boots. They looked like old sneakers, thin and worn down. The prints were fresh, pressed deep into the damp soil, leading from the trees towards the tower, but stopping suddenly a few feet from the edge of the clearing. My chest tightened again. I felt my pulse beating in my ears. I looked around, scanning the trees for any movement, but I didn't see anything. I followed the footprints with my eyes, trying to see where they came from, but they disappeared into the thick bushes. I felt sick to my stomach. Someone was here, watching us, walking around our camp, and I didn't know who it was. I walked back to where the others were setting up their tents and pretended nothing was wrong. My hands were shaking as I unpacked my tent and started setting it up. I kept glancing at the tree line every few seconds. My body felt tense and jumpy. I didn't want to tell anyone about the footprints because I didn't want to scare them, but inside I felt terrified. When evening came, we cooked dinner together. The sun was setting behind the mountains, turning the sky into shades of orange and pink. The air turned cold quickly, and I put on my thick jacket and hat. We sat in a circle eating freeze-dried meals, talking quietly about the next day's hike. I kept scanning the forest behind everyone's backs. The trees were dark now, and the shadows looked deeper, like they were hiding something. As the sky turned dark blue and then black, we decided to go to bed early. Everyone climbed into their tents and zipped them up. I lay in my sleeping bag,